Deep beneath the concrete expanse of Mexico City's Zocalo, in the murky, sediment-filled water that was once Lake Texcoco, a faint shimmer of gold rests in the perpetual dark. Divers and archaeologists dream of finding it, the vast treasure of Moctezuma, lost during a night of terror and desperation centuries ago. This is the legendary curse of Tenochtitlan, not a curse of spirits or ancient magic, but of a weight of history so immense it still haunts the very ground. The gold itself is almost irrelevant. What truly captivates is the story it represents. A story of a magnificent city, a tragic confrontation of worlds, and an empire that rose from the most humble of beginnings. Every so often, a construction project digging new foundations for the ever-sinking modern city will unearth a piece of that past. A carved stone serpent, a sacrificial dagger, or perhaps even a single mud-caked piece of that lost Aztec gold. It is a reminder that the story we are about to explore is not just a tale from a book, but a living history buried just beneath the surface of the present, waiting to be rediscovered. I'm glad you're here. Wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, I'd love to see where and what time you're listening from. It's always a quiet thrill to know where in the world these stories are landing as you drift off to sleep. For now, let's leave the divers and the dream of gold behind and travel much further back to a time before the treasure, before the empire, before even the great city itself. We go in search of a beginning, an origin as shrouded in mist and legend as the island that supposedly birthed a people destined for greatness. Our story begins not with a bang, but with a whisper on an island called Aztlan. The name itself is ethereal, meaning the place of whiteness, or the place of the herons, and it evokes an image of shimmering shores and graceful birds against a placid lake, a scene of almost unnatural perfection. The surviving codices, the beautiful painted manuscripts of the Aztec world, depict it this way: a single, symmetrical island dominated by a tall, curved mountain with a cave at its heart. This was the mythic womb of a people. From this cave, known as Chico Mostoc, the place of 7 caves, 7 tribes emerged, the ancestors of the major Nahuatl-speaking peoples who would later dominate central Mexico. Among them were the Xochimilca, the Tepaneca, and the Tlaxcalans, whose names would become deeply woven into the tapestry of the coming empire. And then there was one more, a seemingly insignificant tribe, the last to emerge, known simply as the Mexica. At this point in the story, they are not yet the mighty Aztecs, for Aztec is merely a name for anyone from Aztlan. The Mexica are just one group among many, living under the thumb of a powerful ruling class, the Azteca Chicomostoca, in a home that was perhaps more of a gilded cage than a paradise. Here, however, we encounter our first great mystery, a question that historians have debated for centuries. Was Aztlan a real place, or was it a beautifully crafted piece of propaganda, a Mesoamerican Camelot invented much later by the Mexica to give their improbable rise to power a sense of divine legitimacy? The frustrating truth is, we may never know for certain. Later, as we will see, an Aztec emperor named Itzcoatl would seize power and systematically burn the histories of his rivals and even of his own people, rewriting their past to better suit his imperial ambitions. This act of cultural vandalism makes finding the original truth like trying to reconstruct a dream upon waking. Scholars and adventurers have spent lifetimes searching for Aztlan, poring over colonial maps and indigenous stories for clues. Some point to the island of Mexcaltitan de Uribe in the state of Nayarit, which bears a striking resemblance to the codex drawings. Others suggest locations further north, deep in the deserts of what is now the southwestern United States, trying to trace the migratory path of the Nahuatl language. But the search has always been fruitless, yielding more theories than certainties. Perhaps Aztlan's power lies not in its geographical location, but in its place in the collective memory of the Mexica. It was their starting point, their Eden from which they were purposefully cast out. Life there, as the legends tell it, had become oppressive. The ruling elite demanded tribute and labor, and the Mexica chafed under their control. They were a people with a restless spirit, a destiny that felt larger than their small island home. They needed a sign, a divine push to set them on their path. And that sign came from a god who was at the time exclusively their own. He was not yet a great deity in the Mesoamerican pantheon, but a fierce, demanding tribal protector god whose name was Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird on the left. His nature was pure paradoxical power. The hummingbird, a tiny, delicate creature capable of incredible feats of strength and aggression, and the left, the southern direction, the region of the sun at its zenith. One day, so the story goes, the priests of the Mexica heard his voice. It may have come through a statue, a bundle of sacred feathers, or in the fevered visions of a shaman. The voice was unmistakable, a buzzing command that resonated in their very souls. It promised them a future of glory, of dominion over all the other peoples of the land. It promised them wealth, power, and a destiny written in the stars. But it came with a condition. They had to leave Aztlan. They had to abandon their ancestral home, turn their backs on the only world they had ever known, and walk into the unknown. Huitzilopochtli would guide them, he promised. He would show them where to settle by revealing a sign, an eagle devouring a serpent while perched upon a nopal cactus. They were to wander, for years or for centuries if need be, until they found this symbol. There, and only there, would they build their new home and begin their ascent to power. It was a terrifying, exhilarating proposition, to leave everything behind based on the whispered promise of a hummingbird god. The Mexica elders gathered, debating the vision, the weight of such a momentous decision settling upon them. To stay meant security, predictability, and continued subjugation. To leave meant hardship, uncertainty, and the slimmest chance at the glorious future their God had promised. For a people who felt destiny stirring in their blood, there was only one real choice. The decision was made. They would walk. They would leave the place of whiteness behind forever and follow the hum of their God's voice into the vast, uncharted wilderness of the south. They stepped away from the shores of Aztlan, not as a triumphant procession, but as a small, uncertain band of pilgrims, the silence of the mainland feeling vast and profound after a lifetime contained by water. At their spiritual and literal center were the Teomamake, the four chosen god-bearers who carried on their shoulders the Tlaquimiloli, the sacred bundle that held the essence of Huitzilopochtli. This was not merely a symbol, To the Mexica, it was their living god, a portable oracle whose rustles and whispers, interpreted by the priests, were their only compass in a world without maps. They were walking away from history and into myth, leaving behind the known world for a divine promise. The journey they began was not a straight march to a destination, but a long and winding ordeal, an epic of wandering that would span nearly 200 years. It was a pilgrimage punctuated by long pauses, where they would halt for a year, sometimes for 20, building temporary towns of wood and thatch, planting crops, and raising children who would know no other life than the journey. It was as if their God was deliberately tempering them, forcing them to learn resilience, to depend on nothing but Him and each other, burning away their old identity in the harsh sun of the northern deserts. With each stop, they learned and changed. They fought skirmishes with hostile tribes, learning to be the fierce warriors their God demanded. They suffered through drought and famine, learning to read the land and survive where others perished. And through it all, the sacred bundle was consulted, its cryptic messages directing them to pack up their meager lives and walk once more into the wilderness. It was during one of these extended stops, at a place they named Coatepec, or Serpent Hill, that the defining event of their migration occurred, an event so profound it would become the central myth of their entire cosmology. At Coatepec, they had built a substantial town, a shrine, and had settled into a comfortable rhythm. The land was fertile, life was good, and a significant faction among the Mexica began to argue that perhaps this was their promised land. They were tired of wandering. They wished to stay. This descent created a dangerous rift, a spiritual crisis that threatened to tear the tribe apart. It was in the midst of this tension that the priests retold, or perhaps created, the story of Huitzilopochtli's own violent birth on this very Serpent Hill. The story began, as all great myths do, with a miracle. The great earth goddess, Coatlicue, she of the serpent skirt, was a pious and ancient deity, sweeping a shrine atop Serpent Hill. As she swept, a ball of fine hummingbird feathers drifted down from the sky. Delighted by its beauty, she tucked it into her waistband, and when she later looked for it, it was gone, for it had miraculously impregnated her. Her other children, 400 sons known as the Senson Huitznahua, the Southern Stars, and their powerful sister, Coyolxauhqui, the Moon, were consumed by rage and shame at their mother's mysterious pregnancy. Convinced she had dishonored them, they plotted a terrible revenge. They would ascend Serpent Hill and kill her. As Coyolxauhqui led her 400 brothers up the mountain, armed and armored for matricide, one of the stars, loyal to his mother, scurried ahead to warn the unborn child in Coatlicue's womb. As the murderous siblings reached the summit, Coatlicue gave birth. But this was no ordinary child. Huitzilopochtli sprang from the womb fully grown, fully armored, his face painted for war, and brandishing his ultimate weapon, the Xiuhcoatl, the turquoise serpent, a bolt of pure solar fire. In a flash of divine fury, he fell upon his siblings. He slaughtered the 400 stars, scattering them across the sky. Then he turned on their leader, his sister, the Moon. He struck her down, and in a final act of cosmic judgment, dismembered her body, kicking her head into the sky and flinging her torso to the bottom of Serpent Hill. This brutal, spectacular myth became the blueprint for the Mexica worldview. Every single dawn was a reenactment of this battle, Huitzilopochtli, the newborn sun, rises in victory, destroying his sister the moon and scattering the stars of the night. It was a story that sanctified relentless, violent struggle as the natural order of the universe. Light must destroy darkness for the world to continue. But here at Coatepec, the story also served a more immediate political purpose, and this is our second great historical mystery. Most historians believe the myth of Huitzilopochtli's birth is a direct allegory for a brutal civil war or political purge that happened among the Mexica at Serpent Hill. The faction represented by Coyolxauhqui, the one that wanted to settle down and end the pilgrimage, was violently suppressed by the hardline warrior faction, the priests and followers of Huitzilopochtli. The myth provided the ultimate justification. Their opponents were not just political rivals, they were cosmic enemies of the sun, and their destruction was a sacred duty. The victory of Huitzilopochtli was the victory of the Migration Party. The command was clear: the journey must continue. After the purge at Coatepec, the tribe was unified in purpose, hardened, and utterly devoted to their singular, demanding God. They left Serpent Hill and pushed south once more, their identity now fully forged. They were no longer the disparate people from Aztlan. They were the Mexica, the chosen instruments of Huitzilopochtli's will. The generations that followed knew nothing but the journey, their character shaped by the dust of the trail and the smoke of the campfire. After nearly 2 centuries of wandering, a people who had become experts in hardship finally crested a high pass in the volcanic mountain range that ringed their destination. Before them, the world opened up. Laid out below was a sight of breathtaking beauty: the Valley of Mexico, a vast basin of interconnected, shimmering lakes. Texcoco, Chalco, Xochimilco, Zumpango, and Zaltocan gleamed like polished turquoise under the thin, high-altitude sun. Dotted along the lake shores and on islands within were the signs of a thriving civilization. The white temples of established city-states, the geometric green patterns of cultivated fields, and the faint haze of smoke from thousands of hearths. They had been led out of a mythical paradise and through a real-world wilderness, and now they stood at the threshold of their promised land. It was a vibrant, crowded, and dangerous world they were about to enter, and they had no idea that they were not just uninvited, but utterly unwelcome. As the Mexica descended from the volcanic peaks into the basin below, their initial awe at the valley's beauty slowly curdled into a sobering apprehension. This was no empty paradise awaiting its chosen people. The Valley of Mexico, or Anahuac as its people knew it, was a bustling, ancient, and deeply sophisticated world. It was a mosaic of powerful city-states, or altepetl, each with its own ruler, its own patron gods, and its own proud lineage. On the western shore of Lake Texcoco stood the formidable city of Azcapotzalco, capital of the dominant Tepanec people. To the east lay Texcoco, home to the Acolua, who prided themselves on their culture and learning. And to the south, on the shores of Lake Xochimilco, was the ancient and revered city of Culhuacan, which claimed direct descent from the legendary Toltecs, the master builders and artists of a bygone golden age. These were not simple towns. They were centers of commerce, learning, and intricate political maneuvering, all interconnected by a constant stream of canoe traffic that crisscrossed the vast lakes. Into this crowded and competitive world walked the Mexica, and they were immediately judged to be lacking. To the established residents of the valley, these newcomers were little more than barbarians. Their clothes were of rough spun fiber, their hair was matted and unkempt from generations of wandering, and their dialect of Nahuatl was considered coarse and unrefined. Most unsettling of all was their intense and bloody devotion to their patron god, Huitzilopochtli, who was unknown and insignificant to the valley's grand pantheon. The Mexica were seen as uncivilized squatters, a people without a proper lineage, without fine temples, and without the social graces that defined life in the great cities. They petitioned the various lords for a place to settle and were met with scorn and rejection. They would be granted a patch of undesirable swampy land, only to be driven off again as soon as they had managed to make it productive. For years, they were pushed from one marginal territory to another, living as tenants and refugees, their grand destiny promised by the hummingbird on the left seeming like a cruel joke in the face of their daily humiliation. Eventually, they managed to secure a foothold in a place that no one else immediately wanted, a rocky wooded hill on the western shore of the lake known as Chapultepec, the Hill of the Grasshopper. For the first time in centuries, they had a home that felt permanent. It was a naturally defensible location with a crucial freshwater spring, and for about a generation, the Mexica knew a measure of peace. They built a small town, a temple for Huitzilopochtli, and their numbers began to grow. They raised their children with the stories of Aztlan and the Great Migration, reminding them that they were a people of destiny, temporarily humbled but not defeated. But their very success at Chapultepec began to unnerve their powerful neighbors. The Tepanecs of Azcapotzalco and the Culuas of Culhuacan watched this growing tribe of outsiders with increasing suspicion. These were not passive refugees. They were organized, disciplined, and fierce warriors, and their presence on such a strategic piece of land was becoming a threat to the delicate balance of power in the valley. The inevitable conflict arrived with swift and overwhelming force. A coalition of warriors from Azcapotzalco and Culhuacan, along with other smaller cities, descended upon Chapultepec. The Mexica fought with the desperate courage of a people defending their only home, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. The battle was a slaughter. The town was sacked and burned, and hundreds of Mexica were killed or captured. Their leader at the time, Huitzilopochtli the Elder, was taken prisoner, marched to Culhuacan, and publicly sacrificed, a final humiliation for his defeated people. The survivors were scattered, fleeing into the vast reed beds of the lake, their brief dream of a home shattered, their tribe on the very brink of extinction. Here we must pause and consider the narrative itself, for another historical mystery presents itself. Was the barbarian reputation of the Mexica entirely accurate, or was it a convenient fiction, useful to both the Mexica and their enemies? For the established powers, labeling the Mexica as uncivilized justified their aggression. For the Mexica themselves, however, the trope of the humble outsider served to make their eventual, incredible rise to power seem all the more miraculous and divinely ordained. The truth is likely more nuanced. They were probably not the unkempt savages their enemies portrayed, but a highly organized and resilient people whose primary crime was being the new, ambitious kid on a very old, very established block. In the desolate aftermath of their defeat, the scattered Mexico survivors regrouped. Leaderless, starving, and with nowhere else to turn, they made a desperate and humbling decision. They sent an envoy to the city that had just destroyed them, to Culhuacan, and begged its ruler, a man named Coxcoxtli, for mercy and a place to live. Coxcoxtli, enjoying his victory, decided to make a show of his power. He agreed to grant them a piece of his territory, a place where they could live as his vassals. The Mexica envoys, relieved and grateful, bowed in submission. The location he had chosen for them was a place called Tizapan, a stretch of land near the southern shore of the lake. As the defeated and bedraggled Mexica were led to their new home, however, they began to understand the cruel nature of the king's gift. The land was a barren, desolate expanse of black, volcanic rock, cracked and sharp, where almost nothing grew. And as they stepped onto the broken ground, they heard the hissing and saw the dry slither of movement everywhere. The ground was alive. Tizapan was infamous throughout the valley for being a wasteland so thoroughly infested with venomous snakes that no one could live there. It was not a refuge. It was a death sentence. Coxcoxtli and his nobles fully expected the last of the troublesome Mexica to be bitten, poisoned, and wiped from the face of the earth within a matter of weeks. The Culhua nobles watched from a safe distance, expecting to hear the death screams of the Mexica from the rocky wasteland of Tizapan. They anticipated that the endless torment of venomous bites would finish what their warriors had started at Chapultepec. But the sounds that eventually drifted from the Badlands were not of agony, but of industry and even celebration. For the hard-bitten Mexica, a land teeming with snakes, was not a curse. It was a miraculous bounty. To a people who revered the power of the serpent, an animal connected to potent deities like the feathered Quetzalcoatl, this was a sacred landscape. More practically, it was a land full of food. With a grim satisfaction that must have utterly baffled their enemies, the Mexica began hunting the vipers, skillfully skinning them, roasting their meat over open fires, and thriving in the very environment designed to eradicate them. When the scouts from Culhuacan returned to their king, Coxcoxtli, they did not bring news of a tribe's demise. They brought unbelievable tales of a people flourishing, growing fat and strong on a diet of pure poison, their settlement of rough volcanic stone expanding day by day. Coxcoxtli, a pragmatic ruler, saw this not as a failure but as an opportunity. Any people this tough, this adaptable, were a valuable asset. Culhuacan was embroiled in a long-standing conflict with the neighboring city-state of Xochimilco, the place of the flower fields. He decided to turn his would-be victims into a weapon. He summoned the Mexica leaders to his court and offered them a deal: fight for him as mercenaries against the Xochimilco, and in return, they would be granted formal status as vassals, better lands, and the right to intermarry with the people of Culhuacan. For the Mexica, it was the chance they had been waiting for, a path out of exile and into legitimacy. They agreed immediately. They joined the Culhua army, but as a separate, semi-independent unit, viewed with a mixture of fear and contempt by the warriors they fought alongside. In Mesoamerican warfare, the primary measure of a warrior's success was not the number of enemies killed, but the number of captives taken alive for later sacrifice. But the Mexica leaders knew that as a small, unsupported contingent, they could not easily drag prisoners back from the front lines. They devised a much grimmer, more efficient method of keeping score. The battle was ferocious, and the Mexica fought with the pent-up fury of a people who had everything to prove. They were a whirlwind of obsidian-bladed clubs and stabbing spears, terrifying the Xochimilco warriors who had never faced such desperate ferocity. When the battle was won and the armies returned to Culhuacan, Coxcoxtli held a great victory feast. He celebrated his own generals, showering them with praise for the handful of captives they had taken. Then, with a condescending smirk, he turned to the Mexica captain and asked where his prisoners were, implying that the newcomers had contributed little. The Mexica leader said nothing. He simply walked to the center of the court and emptied a large sack he had been carrying. Out tumbled a cascade of severed human ears, hundreds of them, a bloody and undeniable tally of the slaughter his warriors had wrought. A horrified silence fell over the court. The Culhua nobles were repulsed, but also deeply impressed. The Mexica were not just barbarians, they were lethally effective barbarians. Their status was instantly transformed. No longer pariahs, they were now respected, if feared, warriors of Culhuacan. Believing their position was finally secure, the Mexica made a request that was in their minds the greatest honor they could bestow. They asked Coxcoxtli for his daughter, to make her a Mexica noblewoman, and more importantly, to elevate her to godhood as the consort of their great god, Huitzilopochtli. This, they explained, would forever cement the alliance between their two peoples. Coxcoxtli, flattered by the proposition and still in awe of their martial prowess, proudly agreed. He sent his daughter, a princess of the esteemed Toltec lineage, to the Mexica camp for the grand ceremony. Here, however, a catastrophic cultural misunderstanding was about to unfold. The Mexica concept of deification was terrifyingly literal. They sacrificed the princess, flayed her body, and had one of their chief priests don her skin as a sacred garment, a ritual associated with the god Zyp-Totec, our Lord the Flayed One, a deity of agricultural renewal and rebirth. They then invited King Coxcoxtli to the ceremony to witness his daughter's glorious transformation. The proud father entered the dark, incense-filled temple, his heart swelling with pride. He saw a priest dancing before the altar of Huitzilopochtli, adorned in a strange, pale costume. The priest brought a torch closer, and as the light fell upon the dancing figure, Coxcoxtli saw it. It was not a costume. It was the skin of his daughter. The king's cry of utter horror and grief echoed through the temple. His love for his daughter and his royal pride curdled into an all-consuming rage. He ran from the temple screaming for his guards, his army, for every man in Culhuacan to take up arms and exterminate the monstrous demons they had harbored in their midst. The war drums of Culhuacan sounded the alarm, a call for annihilation. The Mexica, who may well have anticipated this reaction, were already prepared. They fought a desperate, bloody retreat, a rearguard action that allowed most of their people to escape the avenging army, fleeing back into the one place that had ever offered them refuge, the vast, murky marshlands of Lake Texcoco. They scrambled into their canoes and paddled frantically into the deep reed beds, disappearing just as the enraged Culhua warriors reached the shore. Once again, they were homeless, hunted, And now, after this ultimate act of sacrilege, they were the most reviled and hated people in the entire Valley of Mexico. Adrift in the vast network of waterways that made up the heart of Lake Texcoco, the Mexica were a people cut off from the world, hiding like frightened animals among the towering reeds. The fury of the Culhua army was behind them, but a new, quieter enemy now stalked them: despair. They were utterly alone, their name a curse in every city around the lake, their reputation forever stained by an act of horrifying piety. The grand destiny promised by Huitzilopochtli, the divine charge that had driven them for centuries, must have felt like a bitter and catastrophic deception. They had followed their god's whispers out of their ancestral home, endured generations of wandering, suffered defeat and humiliation, and it had all led them to this: a handful of canoes in a muddy swamp with no land to their name and no future in sight. Their faith, the very bedrock of their identity, was likely cracking under the immense strain. It was in this moment of absolute darkness, when all hope seemed to have been extinguished, that the priests of Huitzilopochtli claimed their god spoke to them one last time. Perhaps it was a frantic, collective vision born of starvation and stress, or perhaps it was a final, desperate gambit by the leadership to hold their people together. The message was simple and direct. The journey was over. The promise made to their ancestors as they departed Aztlan was about to be fulfilled. Their promised land was not in some distant, fertile valley, but here, hidden somewhere within the very marshes where they now hid. The sign they had been searching for, the eagle devouring a serpent atop a cactus, was near. Anxious and skeptical, but with nothing left to lose, the Mexica began to search. They pulled their dugout canoes through the labyrinthine channels of the swamp, the air thick with mosquitoes and the smell of stagnant water. Days were spent parting curtains of dense reeds, startling waterfowl into flight, their eyes scanning every miserable patch of mud and scrub that passed for an island. Then one of the search parties saw it. On a small, unassuming island of mud and rock, a place no one had ever bothered to claim, stood a tall, spiny nopal cactus. And perched on that cactus, with its great wings partially unfurled to catch the morning sun, was a magnificent golden eagle. This alone would have been a breathtaking sight, but it was what the eagle was doing that stopped the hearts of the Mexica warriors. Clutched firmly in one of its powerful talons and held fast in its sharp beak was a writhing, glittering rattlesnake, a creature of the earth, being decisively overpowered by the master of the sky. The eagle was the sun, the serpent was the earth. The sky was consuming the land. It was Huitzilopochtli himself, in his animal form, claiming this spot as his own. The prophecy was not just a story, it was real. This was the place. This was the end of the long walk. The symbolism of the vision was profoundly powerful, a complete encapsulation of their cosmic beliefs. The eagle, a solar animal, represented their god, Huitzilopochtli, and the forces of light, the sky, and masculine power. The serpent, a creature bound to the ground, represented the earth, the water, the darkness, and the feminine power. Its defeat in the eagle's grasp was a divine declaration of the Mexica's destiny to conquer and rule, to impose their solar, warrior ideology upon the peoples of the valley. The prickly pear cactus, the Tenochtitlan, growing from a rock, was the tangible foundation of their new home, a symbol of life springing forth from even the harshest of environments. The warriors who witnessed it fell to their knees in their canoes, weeping with a relief so profound it washed away the bitterness and fear of the preceding weeks. The news spread like wildfire through their small, scattered flotilla. Their God had not abandoned them. Their suffering had not been pointless. Every hardship, every defeat, every humiliation had been a necessary step to guide them to this precise, divinely appointed location. Of course, a more cynical modern historian might look at this miraculous event through a lens of pure strategy, and in doing so, uncover a different kind of brilliance. Was the vision a genuine miracle, or was it a masterful piece of political inspiration? Consider the location. This small, swampy island was, from a strategic standpoint, perfect. It was technically neutral territory, not belonging to any of the powerful lakeshore kingdoms, meaning the Mexica could settle it without immediately starting another war. Surrounded by water, it was eminently defensible, allowing a small group of determined warriors to fend off a much larger land-based army. And while the island itself was poor, the lake around it was rich with resources: fish, frogs, waterfowl, and reeds that could be used for thatching and building. The divine sign may have been a shrewd recognition by the Mexica leadership that this undesirable piece of real estate was, in fact, the single best place for them to rebuild their society. The prophecy gave this pragmatic choice the indisputable weight of divine will, unifying the demoralized tribe behind a single, hopeful purpose. Whether a miracle, a savvy political move, or some combination of the two, the effect was the same. The Mexica had found their home. They named the island Tenochtitlan, the place of the prickly pear cactus on the rock. The traditional year of its founding is 1325. Their first act was not to build palaces, but a humble shrine to their god, a small hut of reeds and mud to house the sacred bundle that had guided them for so long. Then they began the monumental task of creating land where there was none, driving thousands of wooden stakes deep into the soft lake bed, weaving them together with reeds, and filling the spaces with mud and rock. They were literally raising their world out of the water, a testament to their unwavering will. From this muddy, unpromising beginning, from this place of refuge for a hated and exiled tribe, a city that would one day astound the world and rule an empire was about to be born. Having found their promised land, the Mexicas were immediately confronted with its profound limitations. Their divine destiny was to be built upon a foundation of soft mud, on a tiny island that threatened to disappear entirely during the rainy season's floods. A lesser people might have seen the eagle on the cactus as a cruel joke, a prophecy that led them to an impossible piece of real estate. But the Mexica were a people forged in hardship, and their 2 centuries of wandering had taught them unparalleled lessons in adaptation and ingenuity. They did not see a swamp to be drained. They saw a medium to be sculpted. They would not build their city on the lake. They would build it out of the lake, weaving water and earth together to create a wonder of the ancient world. Their solution to the lack of solid ground was a marvel of sustainable engineering, a system that would not only provide the foundation for their city, but also feed its growing population. This was the system of the Chinampas. Imagine a group of Mexica workers standing waist-deep in the shallow, murky water of the lake. They begin by driving long wooden stakes into the soft lake bed, forming a large rectangular outline, perhaps 30 meters long and 2.5 meters wide. This frame is then reinforced with tough reeds and branches woven between the stakes to create a massive submerged basket. Into this enclosure, they pour endless canoe loads of mud and sediment dredged from the bottom of the lake, a rich, dark muck filled with nutrients. They layer it with decaying vegetation, water lilies, and any organic matter they can find, creating a thick, incredibly fertile bed of soil that rises above the water level. At the corners and along the edges of this newly created island, they plant ahueyote willow trees. These trees grow incredibly fast in the wet environment, and their dense, fibrous root systems spread throughout the Chinampa, anchoring it to the lake bed and forming a strong, living wall that prevents erosion. They had created new land. These rectangular, man-made islands, separated by canals just wide enough for a canoe to pass, became the building blocks of Tenochtitlan. This system was a stroke of absolute genius. The Chinampas were not only stable platforms for building huts and eventually stone structures, but they were also agricultural powerhouses. The porous walls and the surrounding water meant the soil was perpetually irrigated, drawing moisture directly from the canals. The constant dredging to build new Chinampas and maintain the canals provided a steady supply of nutrient-rich fertilizer. On these floating gardens, the Mexica could harvest up to 7 different crops a year: maize, beans, squash, tomatoes, chilies, and vibrant flowers destined for the city's many rituals. As the city grew, so did its food supply, with the Chinampas expanding outwards into the lake like a living green grid. What was once a single, muddy island became a vast, interconnected archipelago of fertile gardens and solid ground. A testament to a people who saw potential where others only saw swamp. The canals between them became the city's arteries, bustling with canoe traffic carrying everything from produce and building materials to priests and warriors. Of course, a city on an island needs connections to the outside world. To solve this, the Mexica undertook their next great engineering project, the construction of massive causeways to link Tenochtitlan to the mainland. These were not simple bridges. They were wide, solid roads, some as broad as 45 feet, raised high above the lake's surface. Construction was a monumental undertaking. Thousands of workers would drive double rows of massive wooden pylons, 10 feet apart, deep into the soft lake bed. The space between these pilings was then filled with millions of tons of earth, clay, and rock until a stable roadbed emerged from the water. 3 great causeways eventually radiated from the city's ceremonial center, one north to Tepeyac, one west to Tlacopan, and the longest, nearly 5 miles long, south to the wealthy city of Iztapalapa. These causeways were not just for trade and transit. They were brilliant works of defensive military engineering, built with sections that could be removed. By taking up these wooden bridges, the Mexica could instantly cut their city off from the mainland, turning their capital into an almost impregnable island fortress. Yet 2 great challenges remained. The water itself was often an enemy. The lake was prone to catastrophic floods, and its water was too brackish and salty for drinking. The Mexica solved the latter problem by looking to their past. They built a magnificent twin-channel aqueduct, a marvel of stonework that ran for 3 miles from the fresh springs at Chapultepec the very hill where they had once been so brutally defeated. One channel would always be flowing with fresh water for the city's cisterns and public fountains, while the other could be shut down for cleaning and maintenance, ensuring a constant, reliable supply. To control the floods, they sought the help of their brilliant neighbor, Nezahualcóyotl, the poet king and master engineer of the allied city of Texcoco. Together, they designed and built a colossal dike, 10 miles long, a massive wall of stone and earth that effectively sealed off Tenochtitlan's bay from the main body of Lake Texcoco. This dike not only protected the city from floodwaters, but also helped to desalinate the water within its perimeter, creating a cleaner, more stable aquatic environment. While the Mexica are rightly credited with this incredible city, it's a quiet historical truth that the Chinampa system likely existed in the valley before they arrived. Their unique genius was not in its invention, but in its application on an epic scale, transforming a simple farming method into the foundational technology for a sprawling aquatic metropolis. What had begun as a refuge for outcasts was now, through sheer will and brilliant engineering, becoming the most ordered and impressive city in the Americas, a vibrant Venice of the New World, rising symmetrically and majestically from the shimmering waters of the lake. For the better part of a century, the magnificent city rising from the lake was not a capital of conquerors, but of vassals. The Mexica of Tenochtitlan, for all their engineering prowess and growing population, existed under the shadow of a greater power. The true masters of the Valley of Mexico were the Tepanecs, ruling from their formidable capital city of Azcapotzalco. The long-reigning Tepanec king, Tezozomox, was a cunning and ruthless empire builder, and the Mexicae were one of the sharpest tools in his collection. They paid him tribute, they sought his permission for their royal successions, and most importantly, they fought his wars. As the hired muscle for the Tepanec Empire, the Mexica warriors honed their skills on distant battlefields, earning a reputation for fearsome efficiency. They learned firsthand the logistics of tribute collection, the methods of siege warfare, and the complex political dance of managing subjugated peoples. They were, in essence, attending an advanced course in empire building, all while dutifully sending a portion of their spoils back to their overlord in Azcapotzalco. This delicate, if unequal balance of power was shattered by the one thing that unravels all great empires, a crisis of succession. Tezozomoc, having ruled for decades and expanded his empire to its greatest extent, finally died of old age. His death unleashed the ambitions of his sons. The throne was usurped by his aggressive and paranoid son, Maxtla, who quickly consolidated his power by assassinating any potential rivals. Maxtla lacked his father's political subtlety and saw threats in every shadow. He looked upon the growing strength of his supposed subjects with deep suspicion, particularly the disciplined Mexica in their island fortress and the cultured Acolua of the great city of Texcoco across the lake. The rightful heir of Texcoco, a brilliant young prince named Nezahualcóyotl, had already been driven into exile by Tezozomoc years earlier. Maxtla, deciding to extinguish these two potential threats for good, had the current Mexica ruler, a man named Chimalpopoca, arrested and assassinated. This act of brazen tyranny was a fatal miscalculation. It was one thing to be a vassal to a powerful and respected ruler like Tezozomoc. It was another to be a slave to a paranoid tyrant like Maxtla. The assassination sent shockwaves through Tenochtitlan. The Mexica Council of Elders was thrown into a panic, with many advocating for appeasement and submission, terrified of provoking the full might of the Tepanec military. But a new, powerful voice emerged from the warrior class. It belonged to the new ruler, Itzcoatl, the obsidian serpent, and his fiercely intelligent nephew and chief advisor, a man named Tlacaelel. They argued that submission would only lead to their eventual destruction. Maxtla had shown his hand. He intended to crush them. Their only hope for survival, they argued, was not just to fight, but to win, to break the Tepanec yoke once and for all. It was a call for a desperate, all-or-nothing war for independence. Itzcoatl and Tlacaelel knew they could not face the Tepanec war machine alone. Their first and most crucial move was to forge an alliance with the other great victim of Tepanec aggression, the exiled prince Nezahualcoyotl of Texcoco. Nezahualcoyotl, the future poet king we met earlier, had spent years in hiding, secretly gathering loyal followers and allies in the mountains and in cities beyond the valley that chafed under Tepanec rule. He was a brilliant military strategist and a charismatic leader, the perfect partner for the pragmatic Itzcoatl. The two leaders formed a pact. They also reached out to a smaller city, Tlacopan, a dissident Tepanec town that was willing to betray Maxtla in exchange for a promise of future power. And so, in the year 1427, the Great Triple Alliance was born. The Mexica of Tenochtitlan, the Acolua of Texcoco, and the rebel Tepanecs of Tlacopan united against a common enemy. The Tepanec War was swift, brutal, and decisive. The allied armies, combining the strategic genius of Nezahualcoyotl and the raw ferocity of the Mexica warriors, laid siege to Azcapotzalco. For more than 100 days, the capital of the great Tepanec Empire was choked off from the outside world. Finally, the walls were breached, and the Allied forces poured into the city. The fighting was street to street, a bloody and vengeful affair that ended with the complete sacking of the once unbeatable capital. Maxtla was captured, and in a moment of symbolic justice, he was taken to the Great Pyramid of Azcapotzalco, and his heart was cut from his chest by Nezahualcoyotl himself. With his death, the Tepanec Empire, which had dominated the valley for over a century, ceased to exist. Here we must consider the mysterious role of Tlacaelel, a figure who is perhaps the single most important architect of the Aztec Empire, yet he never wore the crown. The histories written later portray him as the shadowy mastermind, the power behind the throne, who not only conceived of the rebellion, but would go on to invent the very ideology of Aztec supremacy. It was Tlacaelel, the story goes, who would later convince his king to burn the old histories and create a new, glorious narrative for the Mexica people. The historical mystery, however, is how much of this is true. Was he a single, brilliant individual who guided the empire for over 60 years, or was his legend a later creation, a composite figure invented to embody the political genius of the new regime? We may never know for sure, but his influence hangs over everything that comes next. The victory was complete. The vast tribute network that had once enriched Azcapotzalco was now rerouted to the three capitals of the Triple Alliance. A formal power-sharing agreement was made. Of all future tribute collected, 2/5 would go to Tenochtitlan, 2/5 to Texcoco, and the final 1/5 to the junior partner, Tlacopan. A new world order had arrived in the Valley of Mexico, and the Mexica, the one-time lowly refugees, now stood as masters, their city poised to become the heart of an empire. In the exhilarating aftermath of their victory over the Tepanecs, the Mexica found themselves in a curious position. They were masters of a new political reality, partners in the most powerful military alliance the valley had ever seen, yet they were still prisoners of an old narrative. In the minds of the ancient and noble lineages of Texcoco and Culhuacan, the Mexica were still the upstarts, the former swamp dwellers, the uncouth mercenaries whose recent success was more a product of brute force than of legitimate authority. They had won the war, but they had not yet won the argument of history. Their past, as it was recorded in the codices and oral traditions of their neighbors, was a story of poverty, migration, and humiliation. A people destined to rule the world could not have such a lowly origin story. The new ruler, Itzcoatl, and his brilliant, shadowy advisor, Tlacaelel, understood that an empire's foundation is not just stone and military might, but a compelling and unshakable belief in its own greatness. To forge this new belief, they made a decision that was as audacious as it was terrifying, a move of breathtaking cultural confidence and destruction. They decided that the past was a liability, and so the past would have to be erased. Itzcoatl, acting on what most historians believe was the direct counsel of Tlacaelel, issued a royal decree. He commanded that all the ancient books, the historical codices from all the surrounding cities, be collected. This was not merely a call to seize the histories of their defeated Tepanec enemies. The order extended to the records of their allies, and most shockingly, to the old histories of the Mexica themselves. Everything that told the story of their humble beginnings, the generations of wandering, the years spent as vassals and despised refugees, was to be gathered, and then, in an act that forever clouds our understanding of the pre-imperial Aztec world, he had them all burned. In the central plazas, the accumulated knowledge of generations, the beautiful painted books that held the memories of kings and commoners alike, were piled high and set ablaze. This was not a simple act of vengeance or mindless destruction. It was a calculated and brilliant act of political engineering, a complete reboot of reality. The goal was to create a historical vacuum that could then be filled with a new, state-sanctioned narrative, a story carefully crafted to serve the ambitions of an empire. With the old books reduced to ash and smoke, the scribes and priests of Itzcoatl's court set about creating a new history, a grand and glorious epic with the Mexica and their god Huitzilopochtli at its very center. In this new version of the past, their migration from Aztlan was not the desperate flight of a minor tribe, but a stately, divinely guided pilgrimage, with every stop and every hardship a deliberate test from their patron god. Their lineage was subtly altered, embellished with connections to the legendary and revered Toltecs, retroactively granting them a noble pedigree they had never truly possessed. Most importantly, the very nature of their god and their purpose in the world was transformed. Huitzilopochtli was elevated from a mere tribal protector into the supreme deity of the cosmos, the sun itself, engaged in a perpetual, daily struggle against the forces of darkness. And this cosmic war, Tlacaelel's new ideology proclaimed, required fuel. It required the sacred energy found in human blood and hearts. Conquest was therefore not a matter of political ambition or greed. It was a sacred duty. Every Mexico warrior was now a holy warrior, and every war of expansion was a necessary act to keep the sun in the sky and prevent the end of the world. It was a powerful, terrifying, and deeply motivating piece of propaganda. This new history became the official curriculum taught to every child of the nobility, instilling in them an unshakable sense of superiority and a sacred mission to subjugate all other nations in the name of their God. The true extent of this book burning remains a tantalizing historical mystery. Was it a single, massive bonfire, or a more gradual process of censorship and revision? Did any of the old books survive in secret? The tragic reality is that no known Mexica codex from before this period has ever been found, suggesting the purge was devastatingly effective. For us, it means that the Aztec story, as they themselves told it, only truly begins here. Everything before is a faint echo, pieced together from the biased accounts of their enemies, or from the new official history that was designed to obscure as much as it revealed. We are forced to read their story through the lens of the very propaganda they created. Itzcoatl and Tlacaelel had accomplished something remarkable. They had recognized that the person who controls the past controls the future. By destroying the old narratives of Mexica inferiority, they had liberated their people from the constraints of their own history. They were no longer the ragged newcomers to the valley. In their own minds, and in the stories they now told with absolute conviction, they were the chosen people of the sun, and their imperial destiny was now manifest. With the past rewritten and the future consecrated to the god of war, the reign of Itzcoatl, the obsidian serpent, came to a close. He had bequeathed to his people a new identity and a divine purpose. Now it would fall to his successor to translate that purpose into territory, to take the raw, ideological fuel crafted by Tlacaelel and use it to power a relentless engine of imperial expansion. The man who took the throne in 1440 was Itzcoatl's nephew, a proven general who embodied the New Mexico spirit. His name was Moctezuma Ilhuicamina, a title that crackled with authority. Moctezuma, he frowns like a lord, and Ilhuicamina, he shoots arrows at the sky. His reign would mark the transition from a victorious alliance to a true continent-spanning empire. He was the first of the great Aztec emperors, a man who saw conquest not merely as a political tool, but as a sacred obligation. Under Moctezuma I, with the ever-present council of Tlacaelel at his side, the process of expansion was systematized, transformed from a series of opportunistic wars into a state-run industry. The formula was simple, effective, and endlessly repeatable. It often began with the dispatch of imperial merchants, the Pochtesa, who acted as the eyes and ears of the empire, gathering intelligence on a target city-state's wealth and military strength. A pretext for war would be found. Perhaps the merchants were allegedly mistreated, or the city's ruler refused a request to send tribute for a festival in Tenochtitlan. An ultimatum would be delivered by imperial envoys: accept the supremacy of the great god Huitzilopochtli, agree to pay a regular tribute, and all would be well. To refuse was to invite annihilation. Many proud cities, unwilling to bow to the former swamp dwellers, chose to fight. It was rarely a wise decision. The armies of the Triple Alliance, centered on the elite warrior societies of the Mexica, were a disciplined, experienced, and seemingly unstoppable force. Victory in the field was followed by the establishment of the empire's most crucial institution, the tribute system. The Aztec Empire was not an empire of occupation in the way we might think of the Roman one. They did not typically garrison troops in conquered cities or replace local rulers with Mexica governors. Instead, they allowed local life to continue much as it had before, with one crucial difference. The conquered city, or Altepetl, was now obligated to make regular, burdensome payments to the imperial capitals. Imperial tribute collectors, the feared and often despised Kalpixk, were installed to oversee the process. The list of demanded goods was a catalog of all the wealth of Mesoamerica. From the hot coastal lowlands came tropical feathers of unimaginable beauty, jaguar pelts, cacao beans that were used as currency, and balls of raw rubber. From the mountainous south came precious jade, turquoise, and intricate gold work. From all regions came staggering quantities of textiles, warrior costumes, pottery, and of course, endless streams of foodstuffs to feed the booming population of Tenochtitlan. And with every tribute payment came the most precious commodity of all, human beings destined for the sacrificial altars of the capital's many gods. Moctezuma. I pushed the borders of his empire farther than any Mexica ruler had dreamed possible. His armies marched east to the Gulf Coast, subjugating the Aztec peoples and gaining access to the wealth of the tropical forests. They marched south into the rich and mountainous lands of Oaxaca, conquering the Mixtecs, masters of metallurgy and art. While he expanded his power abroad, he also consolidated it at home, enacting a series of sumptuary laws that created a more rigid and stratified society. These laws dictated in minute detail what a person of a certain class could wear, the size of their house, and the foods they could eat, creating a vast and visible gulf between the rapidly enriching nobility and the commoners who fought their wars. He used the new wealth flooding into the capital to begin a grand expansion of the Templo Mayor, the great twin pyramid at the heart of Tenochtitlan, raising it to new heights in honor of Huitzilopochtli and the rain god Tlaloc. Yet in the middle of his triumphant reign, the gods seemed to turn against him. Around the year 1450, a catastrophic famine struck central Mexico. A series of devastating droughts and unseasonable frosts caused crops to fail for 4 consecutive years. The historical chronicles say that Moctezuma opened the state granaries to feed his people, but it was not enough. People starved in the streets of the capital, and some were even forced to sell themselves or their children into slavery for a handful of maize. This great famine, a period of profound trauma, is a key historical mystery, not for its existence, but for its effects on imperial policy. Many historians now believe that the famine dramatically intensified the core tenets of the Aztec ideology. The disaster was seen as a sign of divine anger. The gods were hungry. The sun was weak. The only solution was to appease them with a greater flood of tribute to restock the granaries, and most importantly, a greater number of sacrificial victims to nourish the deities. The famine, therefore, may have been the primary catalyst that pushed the Aztec Empire toward an ever more aggressive and bloodthirsty foreign policy, setting the stage for the ritualized violence that would define their final decades. By the time Moctezuma died, he had laid a foundation of stone and fear, creating an imperial machine that now ran on a constant flow of goods and blood, a system that brought unprecedented splendor to his capital and a simmering resentment throughout the lands he had conquered. The wealth of an empire, now flowing down the great causeways and along the canals, was transforming Tenochtitlan into one of the most spectacular cities on earth. Gleaming white pyramids clawed at the sky. Vast palaces sprawled across acres of man-made land, and the great marketplace buzzed with 1,000 different languages. But this magnificent urban machine was run by an equally complex and deeply stratified social structure, a human pyramid with a god-king at its peak and millions of farmers at its base. To understand the Aztecs is to understand this intricate web of duties, privileges, and obligations that governed every aspect of a person's life from the moment they were born. At the very apex of this pyramid sat a figure of unimaginable power and reverence, the Huey Tlatoani, the Great Speaker. He was the emperor, a semi-divine being who served as the supreme commander of the army, the final judge in all legal matters, and the high priest of the state religion. The ceremony that surrounded him was designed to elevate him far above ordinary mortals. He was carried through the streets on a lavishly decorated litter, and when he passed, commoners were expected to avert their eyes, for to look directly upon his face was an offense punishable by death. The very ground he walked upon was swept clean before his jeweled sandals touched it. Yet this was not an absolute monarchy passed directly from father to son. When a Tlatoani died, a council of the highest nobles, priests, and warriors would convene to select the next ruler from a small pool of eligible royal relatives, typically the late king's brothers or nephews, choosing the man they deemed most capable in warfare and diplomacy. Beneath the great speaker were the Piwum Pilton, the hereditary nobility. These were the descendants of past kings and great heroes, and they lived a life of immense privilege. They resided in spacious two-story stone palaces, some with their own gardens and aviaries. They were entitled to wear fine garments of cotton, intricately embroidered and adorned with the iridescent feathers of tropical birds, a luxury strictly forbidden to the lower classes who had to make do with scratchy maguey fiber. The nobles owned land privately, a right denied to commoners, and they filled all the highest positions in the government bureaucracy, the priesthood, and the military officer corps. This noble class was the administrative backbone of the empire, the C-suite of the vast imperial enterprise. The great mass of the population, the foundation of the entire society, were the Matzihualtan, the commoners. They were the farmers tending the chinampas, the artisans producing pottery and textiles, the laborers who built the great temples, and the rank-and-file soldiers who fought and died in the empire's endless wars. The fundamental unit of their lives was not the city, but the Calpulli. A Calpulli was a collection of families that lived together in the same neighborhood, almost like a city ward or a village. Each Calpulli managed a communal plot of land, which was parceled out to its member families, worshipped its own patron deity at a local temple, and often specialized in a particular craft. The Calpulli was the heart of Aztec social life, a deeply ingrained system of community and mutual support that provided a safety net and a powerful sense of belonging. In return, The Muscowalton had heavy obligations. They paid taxes in both goods and labor, and every Kalpuli was required to provide a quota of young men for military campaigns. Existing somewhat outside this main hierarchy were specialized groups who enjoyed unique status. The most fascinating of these were the Poctetsa, the long-distance merchants. Organized into their own powerful guilds, they would undertake perilous expeditions that lasted for months or even years, traveling to the farthest, most hostile corners of Mesoamerica. They were masters of trade, but they were also the designated spies of the empire, returning to Tenochtitlan, not just with precious goods, but with priceless intelligence about the politics and defenses of unconquered lands. They could become fabulously wealthy, yet they were required by law to be discreet, feigning poverty in public to avoid antagonizing the traditional land-owning nobility, who were often suspicious of their new money. While the social structure was undeniably rigid, it was not an inescapable caste system. A faint but powerful current of social mobility flowed through the society, and its primary engine was warfare. A commoner boy who proved himself exceptionally brave on the battlefield could climb the social ladder. The measure was simple and stark: the number of enemy warriors he could capture and bring back for sacrifice. A young man who captured 4 or 5 enemies could earn the right to enter one of the elite warrior societies, like the Eagle or Jaguar Knights, and could even be elevated to the status of a low-ranking noble, receiving land, titles, and the right to wear the coveted cotton garments. This promise of advancement, however slim, was a powerful motivator that helped make the Aztec army one of the most ferocious fighting forces of its time. At the very bottom of the social ladder were the Tlahtlacotin, the slaves. Aztec slavery, however, was a far cry from the brutal, race-based chattel slavery of the European world. A person became a slave, most often to pay off a debt, as punishment for a crime, or by being captured in war. It was a condition of servitude, not a state of being. Slaves could own property, they could marry, their children were born free, and they could even purchase their own freedom. It was a desperate state, to be sure, but it was not without hope, a condition that reflected the Aztec belief that one's fortune, for better or for worse, was never entirely fixed. The sun rises in the high, thin air of the valley, striking first the twin gold-adorned shrines atop the Templo Mayor, then slowly spilling its light down the steep pyramid steps and across the sprawling city. It illuminates the placid green rectangles of the chinampas and the dark, shimmering water of the canals. As the light touches the thatched roofs of the commoners' homes, the city awakens not with a sudden roar, but with a steady, rhythmic, grinding sound. It is the sound of life itself in Tenochtitlan, the sound of women kneeling before a sloping stone slab, the metat, beginning the hours-long, sacred work of grinding maize into dough for the day's tortillas. This sound is the city's heartbeat, the gentle percussion that underlies every other aspect of daily existence. Inside a typical commoner's home, a simple one-room house of adobe brick built upon a man-made island, the day begins before the sun is fully up. The family sleeps on woven reed mats, the petlatl, which are rolled up during the day to create more space. While the woman of the house begins her grinding, her husband prepares for his work in the fields or the artisan's workshop. The first meal is a simple, nourishing one, a warm, thick gruel called atole, made from maize flour and sometimes sweetened with honey or spiced with chili. It provides the energy needed for a day of hard labor. The husband then steps out of the cool, dark interior of his home into the bright morning, his world a patchwork of green gardens and blue water. If he is a farmer, his commute is short. He simply walks to the edge of his family's chinampa and begins to tend his crops with a fire-hardened digging stick called a koe. The work is methodical, peaceful, dictated by the sun and the seasons, weeding the rows of maize, tending the climbing beans, and ensuring the squash have room to grow in the impossibly fertile, self-irrigating soil. The canals are already coming to life, the main thoroughfares of this aquatic metropolis. Thousands of canoes, from small personal watercraft to large, flat-bottomed barges, glide silently through the water. They carry everything that a great city needs: merchants poling barges piled high with firewood from the mainland, farmers bringing their surplus produce to market, and finely dressed nobles being paddled to their duties in the central precinct. The city is remarkably clean. Squadrons of city workers sweep the wide causeways and public plazas, and barges are used to collect refuse, which is then taken to be used as fertilizer on the chinampas. It is an ordered, organized world, a far cry from the filth and squalor of a contemporary European city. As the sun climbs higher, all of this traffic, all of this energy, finds its way to the city's so thrumming heart. The great market at Tlatelolco it is one of the largest and most vibrant marketplaces in the entire world. To step into its vast, open plaza is to be overwhelmed by a sensory flood. The air is thick with 1,000 competing smells: the sharp tang of chilies, the sweet scent of vanilla and tropical fruits, the earthy aroma of fresh tortillas cooking on clay griddles, and the pungent smell of herbal medicines. The roar of tens of thousands of people haggling and greeting each other is a constant, humming backdrop. Everything one could possibly desire is here, laid out in a meticulously organized fashion. There are entire aisles dedicated to pottery, others for obsidian blades ground to a razor's edge, and still more for magnificent textiles of cotton and feather. In the food section, one can find live turkeys gobbling in wooden cages, hairless dogs bred for meat, fish still dripping with lake water, and pyramids of colorful produce. In the luxury section, the Poctexa merchants display their exotic wares from distant lands: jade beads, turquoise mosaics, shimmering jaguar pelts, and the most valuable commodity of all, the long, iridescent green tail feathers of the quetzal bird. There is no official currency. Business is conducted through a complex system of barter, though cacao beans are used as a kind of small change for everyday transactions. The entire operation is overseen by market judges who patrol the aisles, ready to instantly settle any dispute with an unassailable authority. The true population of Tenochtitlan remains a captivating historical mystery, with estimates ranging from 80,000 to over 250,000 people. If the higher numbers are correct, this city, sustained by its ingenious chinampas and aqueducts, was significantly larger than any contemporary city in Europe, including London or Paris. As the afternoon sun begins to wane, the market crowds thin, and people begin to pole their canoes home. The family gathers again for the main meal of the day, which is almost always centered on the tortillas the mother has spent her day preparing. They are eaten with a salsa of tomatoes and chilies, accompanied by beans and perhaps a small piece of fish or turkey. As darkness falls, the city grows quiet, lit only by the flickering flame of pine torches and the brilliant canopy of stars in the clear mountain sky. The family would gather to listen to the elders tell the stories of their gods and heroes. Then they would unroll their reed mats once more, lying down to sleep as the gentle lapping of water in the canals whispers them into the quiet of the night, ready to awaken at dawn and begin the cycle all over again. For the people of Tenochtitlan, the grinding of maize, the paddling of a canoe, and the striking of an obsidian blade were more than just daily tasks. They were small acts performed within a vast and living cosmos. There was no clean line separating the mundane world from the divine. The universe was not a distant, clockwork mechanism set in motion by a remote creator, but a chaotic and terrifyingly alive arena of struggle. The core of the Aztec worldview was the concept of duality. Everything that existed had its opposite, its cosmic rival. Day battled night, heat fought cold, life was locked in an eternal struggle with death. The world they inhabited was not a state of peace, but a precarious, fragile balance achieved through the constant, violent tension between these opposing forces. It was a universe that had to be actively maintained, a cosmic engine that required constant attention lest it shudder to a catastrophic halt. This profound sense of cosmic instability was rooted in their most sacred creation story, the legend of the 5 suns. According to the priests, the world as they knew it was not the first creation, but the 5th. The gods had tried and failed 4 previous times to create a stable world and a suitable form of humanity. Each of these ages, or suns, had been ruled by a different deity and had ended in its own unique apocalypse. The first sun, ruled by the jaguar god Tezcatlipoca, was destroyed when its giant inhabitants were devoured by jaguars. The second sun, ruled by the wind god Quetzalcoatl, was obliterated by a mighty hurricane that turned its human population into monkeys. The third sun, ruled by the rain god Tlaloc, ended in a rain of fire, and the fourth, ruled by the water goddess, was consumed by a great flood that transformed its people into fish. Their current age, that's the 5th sun, was born from an ultimate act of divine sacrifice at the ancient holy city of Teotihuacan. After the destruction of the 4th world, the gods gathered in the darkness to decide who would become the new sun. A magnificent, wealthy god named Tecutziztecatl volunteered, but he hesitated at the last moment, afraid to leap into the great sacrificial fire. It was then that a small, humble, and sickly god named Nanawatson, showing true courage, threw himself into the flames without a second thought. He was transformed, rising into the sky as the new, brilliant sun. Shamed by this act, Tecutziztecatl finally leapt into the now weaker embers and rose as the less brilliant moon. But the new sun did not move. It hung motionless in the sky, burning too intensely. To set the cosmos in motion, the rest of the gods understood that they too had to sacrifice themselves, offering their own divine blood to give the sun the energy it needed to begin its journey across the sky. This story was the single most important pillar of Aztec religion and statecraft. It established a profound and inescapable cosmic debt. The world existed, the sun moved, and humanity lived only because the gods had sacrificed themselves first. Therefore, it was the sacred duty of humanity and specifically of the Mexica as the self-proclaimed people of the sun to repay that debt. Their great god, Huitzilopochtli, the sun, was engaged in a daily life-or-death battle against the forces of darkness, his sister the moon, and his 400 brothers, the stars. This cosmic struggle exhausted him. If he were to weaken, the darkness would triumph, and the world would end in a series of terrifying earthquakes, just as the prophecies for the fifth sun foretold. To prevent this, humanity had to nourish the gods, to feed them with the most potent and sacred energy they knew, Chalchihuatl, the precious water, which was the life force contained in human blood. This belief animated a complex and crowded pantheon of deities, many of whom were ancient gods adopted from the various peoples the Mexica had conquered. Huitzilopochtli was their divine patron, the warrior sun, but they also revered Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, a powerful and capricious god of the night sky, fate, and sorcery, whose sacred animal was the jaguar. They worshipped his eternal rival, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, the god of wisdom, civilization, and the wind that sweeps the path for the rain. And they lived in fear and awe of Tlaloc, the ancient goggle-eyed god of rain and fertility, who could bless their crops with life-giving showers or curse them with devastating droughts and floods. It was Tlaloc's shrine that stood beside Huitzilopochtli's atop the Templo Mayor, a testament to the equal importance of warfare and agriculture in their precarious world. The Mexica worldview was therefore one of awesome and terrifying responsibility. They were not passive observers of the universe. They were its active caretakers, charged with the monumental task of keeping the sun in the sky and the world in balance, a duty that demanded constant vigilance, endless ritual, and a steady stream of the sacred substance that paid the debt to their self-sacrificing gods. No aspect of Aztec civilization has captured the modern imagination or provoked more horror than the rite of human sacrifice. It is the bloody heart of their story, and acts so alien to our own sensibilities that it often eclipses every other facet of their complex and sophisticated culture. But to simply label it as a brutal and savage practice is to misunderstand it from the start. For the Mexica, human sacrifice was not an act of wanton cruelty or murder. It was the ultimate act of piety, a solemn and necessary transaction with the divine, and the terrible sacred duty that came with their role as the caretakers of the cosmos. It was the chillingly logical endpoint of the worldview we have just explored. A universe born from the sacrifice of the gods could only be sustained by the sacrifice of mortals. The central purpose of these rites was to repay the cosmic debt. The life force contained within the human heart and blood, the Chalchihuatl, was the sacred nourishment needed by the gods, especially the sun god Huitzilopochtli, to sustain them in their daily battle against the forces of darkness. The ideal offering, the one considered most pleasing to the gods, was the heart of a brave enemy warrior captured in battle. A warrior's courage and strength made his life force particularly potent. For this reason, the primary goal of Aztec warfare was not to kill the enemy on the battlefield, but to capture them alive. Other gods required different types of offerings. The goggle-eyed rain god, Tlaloc, might be appeased by the sacrifice of children, whose tears were thought to be a sacred symbol of the rain he commanded. Fertility goddesses might be honored with the sacrifice of young women. but the vast majority of victims were the anonymous soldiers of enemy states, the human tribute that flowed into Tenochtitlan alongside the cotton, jade, and cacao. The ceremony itself was a grand and theatrical public spectacle, the climactic scene in the religious dramas that dominated the Aztec calendar. Imagine the great ceremonial precinct of Tenochtitlan, the plaza packed with thousands of citizens. The air is thick with the scent of burning copal incense and the sound of deep, booming drums and the mournful blast of conch shell trumpets. The chosen victim, or Ixipla, was not seen as a mere captive. In the days or weeks leading up to the ceremony, they were transformed into a divine vessel, an impersonator of the very god to whom they would be sacrificed. They were bathed, dressed in magnificent costumes and sacred regalia, and treated with the utmost honor as if they were the god walking among mortals. When the appointed hour arrived, the victim was led up the impossibly steep stone staircase of the Templo Mayor. At the summit, before the shrine of the god, a team of priests would be waiting. 4 of them would seize the victim, holding them by their arms and legs, and stretching them backwards over a low, convex sacrificial stone. A 5th priest, wielding a ceremonial knife with a handle of turquoise mosaic and a blade of razor-sharp obsidian, would perform the final act. With a swift and practiced movement, he would make an incision just below the rib cage, reach into the chest cavity, and sever the arteries to remove the still-beating heart. This heart was then held aloft, an offering to the sun, before being placed in a sacred stone vessel called a kyoikali, or eagle-gourd bowl. The now lifeless body was then rolled down the steep steps of the pyramid to the plaza below. While the cosmic motivation was paramount, this ritual also served a profoundly important political purpose. The grand scale of the sacrifices at Tenochtitlan was a calculated act of statecraft, a terrifying display of imperial power. When ambassadors and tribute payers from vassal states were brought to the capital for these festivals, they would witness hundreds or even thousands of their own countrymen being sacrificed. The message was unambiguous. This is the fate of our enemies. The power of the Mexica is the power of the gods, and our military is invincible. It was psychological warfare on a cosmic scale, a tool of intimidation that helped hold a resentful empire in check. The scale of these events remains a subject of intense debate. Aztec and Spanish chronicles speak of numbers that are almost impossible to imagine. The dedication of the Great Temple in 1487 supposedly involved the sacrifice of over 20,000 people. While many modern historians believe these numbers are symbolic exaggerations, a form of propaganda by both the Aztecs to inflate their power and the Spanish to justify their conquest, there is no doubt that the practice was widespread and occurred on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. To the Aztecs, it was all part of the necessary, brutal calculus of existence. They believed they lived on the brink of apocalypse, and the blood of warriors was the price they had to pay to hold back the darkness and ensure that the sun would rise again tomorrow. While the great pyramids of Tenochtitlan were stages for the grim theater of sacrifice, they were also monuments of breathtaking astronomical precision, and the culture that consecrated them with blood also filled them with art of incredible sophistication and beauty. The Aztec mind was a place of stark dualities, capable of both the deepest reverence for life-giving maize and the terrifying logic of the sacrificial knife. To move past the blood and incense of their rituals is to discover a world of brilliant astronomers, peerless craftsmen, and master philosophers of time, a people who sought to capture the order of the cosmos in stone, feathers, and intricate calendars. Aztec art was rarely created for simple decoration. It was almost always a vessel for religious and political power. It was functional art, designed to give tangible form to the terrifying and majestic gods who populated their universe. Their stone sculptors could create works of intimidating, monstrous power, like the famous statue of the earth goddess Coatlicue, her head formed of two meeting serpents, and her necklace made of human hands and hearts. Yet they could also carve with a breathtaking naturalism, capturing the gentle smile of Xochipilli, the Prince of Flowers, a deity of art, games, and beauty. Their most skilled artisans, the Tolteca, a name they took from the legendary Toltecs, whom they admired as masters, created objects that were considered more precious than gold. The Amanteca, or feather workers, would spend months creating shimmering mosaics from the iridescent plumage of hummingbirds and the impossibly green tail feathers of the Quetzal bird, crafting magnificent shields, fans, and royal cloaks that seemed to be alive with light and color. Other masters created masks and ceremonial daggers covered in intricate mosaics of turquoise, shell, and jet, masterpieces of patience and skill that adorned priests and the idols of the gods themselves. This artistic genius was matched by a profound intellectual curiosity about the world around them, particularly the sky. The priests of Tenochtitlan were also astronomers, and the rooftops of the temples served as their observatories. They meticulously charted the movements of the sun, the moon, and the planet Venus, which held a special and often ominous significance. They understood the celestial mechanics of solstices, equinoxes, and eclipses, viewing these events not as random occurrences, but as moments when the veil between the earthly and divine worlds grew thin. This knowledge was practical, helping to guide the agricultural cycle, but it was also deeply sacred. The entire city of Tenochtitlan was a kind of cosmic map, its temples and causeways carefully aligned with key astronomical points, so that on certain holy days, the sun would rise or set perfectly framed by a pyramid or a sacred mountain on the horizon. Nowhere is their obsession with cosmic order more apparent than in their complex and beautiful calendar system. The Aztecs measured time not with one calendar, but with two, running simultaneously like a pair of interlocking gears. The first was the Xiuhpohualli, a 365-day solar calendar that governed the agricultural year and the cycle of public festivals. It was made up of 18 months of 20 days each. This accounted for 360 days. The final 5 days, known as the Nemontemi, were considered profoundly unlucky. They were a time outside of time, when the normal order of the universe was suspended and the portals to the spirit world were open. During the Nemontemi, people would stay in their homes, fast, and avoid all but the most essential activities, waiting anxiously for the new year to begin and the world to be set right again. Running in parallel to this was the Tonopahwali, the 260-day sacred calendar. This was the calendar of fate and divination. It was formed by the interlocking cycle of 20 named days, like crocodile, wind, death, and flower, and a cycle of 13 numbers. Each day had a unique designation, 1 to crocodile, 2 wind, and so on, and its specific combination of name and number carried a unique destiny, determining whether it was a good day to plant crops, go to war, or be born. The full cycle of these two calendars aligning, the point at which a specific solar date and a specific sacred date would coincide again, took 52 years. The end of one of these 52-year cycles was a moment of supreme cosmic terror, culminating in the new fire ceremony, where all the fires in the empire were extinguished as the populace watched the stars, waiting to see if the gods would grant them another cycle of life, or if the world would finally end. The most famous artifact of this worldview is the magnificent Piedra del Sol, the Sunstone. It is not a calendar, as it is often called, but a monumental depiction of the Aztec cosmos itself. At its center is the face of the sun god, surrounded by the symbols of the 4 previous suns that were destroyed. The next ring contains the 20-day signs of the sacred calendar, and the entire disk is encircled by 2 great fire serpents, the carriers of time itself. The true purpose of this massive stone disk, whether it was a sacrificial altar or a royal throne, remains a mystery, but its meaning is clear. It is a definitive statement that the Mexica understood the workings of time and the universe, and that they, the people of the sun, were living at its very center, charged with keeping its delicate machinery in motion. The Aztec universe, a cosmos balanced on a knife's edge and meticulously tracked by interlocking calendars, required a constant influx of sacred energy to survive. This belief transformed the Aztec military from a mere tool of political conquest into a sacred institution, a vast and intricate machine designed to harvest the very substance that kept the sun in the sky. The Aztec warrior was not just a soldier fighting for land and tribute. He was a holy provider, and the battlefield was his consecrated ground. This fusion of piety and violence gave rise to one of the most unique and misunderstood forms of conflict in human history, the Xochiaoyotl, the Flowery War. These were not wars of annihilation. They were pre-arranged, ritualized conflicts fought between the Aztec Triple Alliance and their unconquered enemies, most famously the powerful Confederacy of Tlaxcala. A flowery war was conducted more like a sacred tournament than a conventional battle. The opposing armies would agree to meet at a designated time and place on a holy field known as a Cuautlali. The primary objective was not to seize territory, sack cities, or even to kill the enemy, though death was a constant and expected outcome. The paramount goal was to capture high-status enemy warriors alive and bring them back to Tenochtitlan for sacrifice. It was, in the starkest terms, a form of human harvesting, a way to acquire the most potent offerings for the gods without engaging in a costly, full-scale war of subjugation. These ritual battles also served as the ultimate training ground for the Aztec army, a live-fire exercise where young warriors could prove their courage and experienced veterans could maintain their deadly skill. The Aztec military that waged these strange wars was not a professional standing army in the modern sense, but a society-wide institution built upon the bedrock of the Calpulli system. Every able-bodied commoner man was a soldier in waiting. From a young age, boys were educated at their local neighborhood school, the Telpachcali, where they learned the arts of war alongside civic duties. When the war drums sounded, Each Calpulli would muster its own regiment of warriors who would march and fight together under their own local leadership, creating a powerful sense of camaraderie and unit cohesion. While every man was a soldier, true glory and social advancement were reserved for the elite. A commoner could rise through the ranks through sheer merit on the battlefield, and the measure of that merit was the number of captives he took. A warrior who captured his first enemy earned the right to cut his hair in the distinctive style of a warrior. Capturing more enemies brought greater prestige and rewards. Those who captured 4 or more enemies were eligible to join one of the 2 most prestigious military orders, the Eagle Knights and the Jaguar Knights. These were the special forces of the Aztec army. They wore spectacular and intimidating war costumes, including helmets carved to look like the snarling head of a jaguar or the open beak of an eagle. They believed these outfits bestowed upon them the spiritual essence of these powerful predators. The Aztec warrior's primary weapon was the fearsome macuahuitl, a paddle-shaped club of heavy oak, edged with razor-sharp shards of obsidian volcanic glass. It was not designed to stab, but to slash and bludgeon, capable of inflicting horrific wounds, and according to some accounts, even decapitating a horse. For ranged attacks, they used the atlatl, a spear-throwing device that acted as a lever, allowing a warrior to hurl a small dart or telekashli with incredible velocity and accuracy over a much greater distance than by hand alone. Their primary defense was a small, decorated shield of wood and hide called a chimali, and armor made of densely packed cotton soaked in brine, a surprisingly effective material that was lightweight and excellent at stopping the cuts of obsidian blades. There is, however, a lingering historical debate over the true nature of the Flowery Wars. Were they truly just a mutually agreed upon ritual for sacrifice and training, or was this a convenient fiction that masked a more brutal, pragmatic strategy? Some historians argue that the Flowery Wars were a cynical and effective form of long-term, attritional warfare. By engaging their strongest unconquered foe, the Tlaxcalans, in constant low-level conflict, the Aztecs could systematically bleed them of their best warriors, weakening them over generations and preventing them from ever uniting to become a true existential threat. The Tlaxcalans themselves certainly never saw these battles as mere ritual. They fought with a desperate ferocity to kill, not just to capture. From their perspective, the Flowery War was a perpetual siege, a relentless war of terror waged by a demonic empire. Whichever interpretation is correct, the result was the same. The Aztec military machine, fueled by religious fervor and personal ambition, was the obsidian edge of their civilization, a perfectly honed instrument for feeding the gods and expanding the empire. The imperial machine, with its elite warrior societies and its sacred mandate for war, was a weapon of immense power. After a few relatively quiet reigns that consolidated the gains of Moctezuma I, a new Huey Tlatoani ascended the throne in 1486, who would wield that weapon with a ferocity and effectiveness that would stun Mesoamerica. He was Ahuitzotl, and his very name, meaning water beast, evoked a sense of monstrous and unpredictable power. Where his predecessors had been a mix of statesmen, diplomats, and generals, Ahuitzotl was a pure, undiluted warrior king, arguably the greatest military commander the Aztecs ever produced. His reign was the violent, bloody zenith of the Aztec Empire. Ahuitzotli's time as emperor was one of relentless, almost constant warfare. He saw the divine mission to feed the gods not as a political justification, but as a literal, urgent command. He personally led his armies on campaign after campaign, famous for his brilliant tactics, his lightning-fast movements, and his absolute ruthlessness. He began his reign by brutally putting down a rebellion in the northern Huastec lands, and he used the campaign to set the tone for his rule. Rather than simply reimposing tribute, he ordered mass executions and deportations, a terrifying lesson to any other vassal state contemplating defiance. He then turned his armies south and west, pushing the boundaries of the empire to their farthest limits. His warriors marched all the way to the Pacific coast and south into the coveted cacao-growing lands of Xoconochco on the modern border of Mexico and Guatemala. With these conquests, he more than doubled the size of the territory controlled by the Triple Alliance, and an unprecedented flood of new and exotic tribute poured into Tenochtitlan. But conquest for Ahuitzotl was not just an end in itself. It was the means to achieve his one great obsession, the glorification of his god, Huitzilopochtli. He initiated the eighth and final great expansion of the Templo Mayor, building a massive new pyramid over the top of the existing one, raising the twin shrines of the war god and the rain god to their most magnificent and towering height. To consecrate this monumental achievement, he planned a ceremony of a scale never before witnessed, a sacrificial offering so vast it would permanently etch the power of the Aztecs into the memory of all nations. For years leading up to the temple's rededication in 1487, the Aztec armies waged war with a singular goal: to bring back as many captives as humanly possible for the great event. The ceremony itself was the ultimate expression of the Aztec ideology of rule through terror. For 4 days and 4 nights, a grand, horrific festival of death was held in the heart of the capital. Dignitaries from every corner of the empire, both loyal allies and resentful vassals, were summoned to watch. They saw 4 immense columns of captive warriors stretching for miles along the city's causeways, waiting their turn to ascend the steep steps of the new pyramid. The historical chronicles, both Aztec and Spanish, report numbers that are difficult to comprehend, claiming that anywhere from 20,000 to over 80,000 victims were sacrificed. While modern historians rightly question the logistics of such a feat and suspect the numbers were exaggerated for propaganda, the political message was brutally clear. Standing at the top of the pyramid, Ahuitzotl himself, along with the kings of Texcoco and Tlacopan, took part in the ritual, demonstrating to a captive audience the absolute power of their gods and the lethal reach of their armies. It was the most potent act of psychological warfare imaginable. Ahuitzotl, the man of blood and fire, did not meet his end on the battlefield that he so clearly loved. His death was a strange and ironic accident. In an effort to increase the city's fresh water supply, he commissioned a new aqueduct, but his engineers warned him the source was too powerful to control. He pressed on, and during the inauguration, a massive surge of water burst from the new channel, causing a major flood in the center of Tenochtitlan. As the emperor fled through the low-ceilinged rooms of his partially submerged palace, he struck his head violently on a stone door lintel. He would die from the head trauma some years later, a man named for a water beast, undone by a torrent of water. He left behind an empire at its absolute peak of territorial expansion and power. The splendor of Tenochtitlan was unparalleled, and the fear of its armies was absolute. But it was a brittle zenith. Ahuitzotli's reign of terror had stretched the empire to its limits, leaving a legacy of profound hatred and a burning desire for revenge among the millions of people subjugated by his brutal campaigns. The Aztec sun had reached its blazing noon. The long, quiet afternoon was about to begin. The death of the ferocious Ahuitzotl in 1502 marked the end of an era. The age of relentless, explosive expansion was over. To replace him, the Council of Elders chose his nephew, a man who could not have been more different from his predecessor. His name was Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, Moctezuma the Younger, and he was not a warrior at his core, but a priest. Before ascending the throne, he had been the head of the Kalmakak, the elite school for the nobility, a scholar of the sacred calendars, and a man known for his deep, almost obsessive piety. He was a contemplative, philosophical ruler, inheriting an empire forged in fire, yet his own nature was one of introspection and a deep reverence for the divine order of the universe. His early reign was successful by any traditional measure. He led campaigns to solidify the vast territories his uncle had conquered, proving his capability as a military commander. He also turned his focus inward, reforming the court and the state bureaucracy to create an even more rigid and hierarchical society. Under Moctezuma II, the gulf between the nobility and the commoners became a chasm. He dismissed all commoners from high office in the palace, creating an imperial court of almost unimaginable opulence and ceremony, further cementing the Huey-Tlatoani's status as a semi-divine being, far removed from the people he ruled. Tenochtitlan had never been more magnificent. The tribute had never been more plentiful, and the power of the emperor had never seemed more absolute. Yet, beneath this glittering surface of supreme confidence, a current of deep anxiety ran through Moctezuma's reign. The empire was a massive and unwieldy entity. The sheer distance to its outer provinces made communication and control difficult, and rebellions were a constant simmering threat that had to be repeatedly and brutally suppressed. And for a man as devout and attuned to the whispers of the cosmos as Moctezuma, the world in the final decade of his reign began to feel deeply, terrifyingly wrong. According to the histories written after the conquest, a series of 8 bizarre and inexplicable omens, or Tetzahuitl, began to occur, each one a terrifying sign that the cosmic order was beginning to unravel. The first omen was a tongue of fire, a great pyramid of light that appeared in the eastern sky shortly after midnight. It was said to be so bright it turned the night to day, and it appeared every night for an entire year, a silent, bleeding wound in the heavens. The second came when the great temple of Huitzilopochtli, the very house of the war god, spontaneously burst into flames. There was no apparent cause, and when the people threw water on the fire, the flames only seemed to grow higher and angrier. The third omen was a bolt of lightning from a cloudless sky, striking a minor temple and burning it to the ground without a single clap of thunder. The fourth was a comet, or perhaps 3, that streaked across the sky in the middle of the afternoon, raining sparks of fire upon the city. The very earth and water seemed to be in revolt. The fifth omen came when the waters of Lake Texcoco, usually so calm, began to boil and foam without any wind, rising up and flooding a portion of the city, destroying homes. The sixth was an omen of sound. A weeping woman heard wailing through the streets in the dead of night, crying out, "O my beloved sons, we are lost. Where can I take you?" The seventh omen was perhaps the strangest of all. Some fishermen caught an unusual, ash-colored bird, like a crane, that had a perfect obsidian mirror set into the crown of its head. They brought it to Moctezuma, and when he looked into the mirror, he did not see his own reflection. He saw the night sky, and then, looking deeper, he saw a vision of a great host of warriors, armed for battle, riding upon the backs of creatures that looked like large deer. When he looked a second time, the vision was gone. The final omen was of monstrous births. People were born with two heads, but would vanish the moment they were presented to the emperor. These portents, whether they truly happened as described, or were a poetic, post-conquest attempt to explain an unthinkable catastrophe, plunged the deeply religious Moctezuma into a state of profound dread. He summoned his wisest priests, soothsayers, and magicians, but no one could offer an explanation that satisfied him. He felt as if the universe was speaking to him in a language of terror, warning him of a great and terrible change that he was powerless to stop. He, the master of the most powerful empire in the known world, became a prisoner of his own fatalism. Surrounded by the splendor of his court, he was an emperor in waiting, his eyes fixed on the eastern horizon, the direction of the fiery omen, expecting the arrival of a disaster he could not name, but which he felt with every fiber of his being was coming to end his world. While Moctezuma II wrestled with the dark portents that haunted his nights, the vast empire he commanded was wrestling with its own deep and dangerous fractures. From the gleaming ceremonial precinct of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec Empire looked like a monolithic and eternal powerhouse, a perfect reflection of the cosmic order. But this was an illusion. The empire was not a unified nation of loyal citizens. It was a fragile and resentful coalition of conquered peoples, a mosaic of 100 different cultures bound to the center not by shared identity, but by shared fear. The glorious Aztec sun that shone so brightly from the capital cast a long and oppressive shadow over the millions who labored beneath it. The very structure of Aztec imperialism was its greatest strength and its most profound weakness. The Mexica and their Triple Alliance partners were masters of indirect rule. When they conquered a city-state, they did not, as a rule, tear down its government or force its people to adopt the Nahuatl language or the worship of Huitzilopochtli. Local kings were usually left on their thrones, and local customs were allowed to continue. All the Aztecs demanded was absolute obedience, and most importantly, the regular payment of tribute. This system was incredibly efficient, allowing a relatively small number of Mexica to control a vast territory. But it fostered no sense of belonging or loyalty. The Totonacs of the Gulf Coast, the Mixtecs of Oaxaca, and the Zapotecs of the South did not consider themselves Aztecs. They were Totonacs, Mixtecs, and Zapotecs who now had a new, more demanding, and far more violent set of overlords. The tribute itself was a constant draining burden. From every corner of the empire, a river of wealth flowed into Tenochtitlan. It was a tax paid not in currency, but in the very lifeblood of the provincial economies. Immense quantities of maize, beans, and cotton, intricate pottery and precious gemstones, jaguar pelts, and the shimmering green feathers of the quetzal. This ceaseless demand impoverished local communities and served as a constant reminder of their subjugation. Even more than the material goods, the tribute demanded in human lives created a deep and abiding hatred. The regular quota of young men and women taken from their homes to be sacrificed on the altars of Tenochtitlan was a wound that never healed, a source of spiritual horror and a desire for vengeance that simmered just beneath the surface of imperial control. This control was maintained by a simple and brutal calculus of terror. The lessons of Ahuitzotl's reign had been well learned. Any hint of rebellion was met with a swift and overwhelming military response. An Aztec punitive expedition was a terrifying thing. The rebellious city would be sacked, its leaders executed, and its people subjected to even more crushing tribute demands as punishment. This policy was effective at keeping the peace, but it was a peace born of fear, not of consent. The empire was held together by a perpetual state of low-grade warfare and the ever-present threat of annihilation. Crucially, however, not everyone had been conquered. Encased within the empire, like a stone in the heart of a fruit, was the independent and fiercely proud confederacy of Tlaxcala. For generations, the Tlaxcalans had been the Aztecs' mortal enemies. Surrounded on all sides, they had withstood decades of Aztec aggression, fighting them to a bloody standstill in the endless ritualized slaughter of the Flowery Wars. The Aztecs had imposed a strict economic embargo, cutting Tlaxcala off from access to vital goods like salt and cotton. But this isolation had not broken the Tlaxcalans. It had hardened them, forging a society dedicated to military readiness and united by a singular, all-consuming hatred of the Mexica. They were a permanent, unhealed wound in the side of the empire, a bastion of defiance that proved the Aztecs were not, in fact, invincible. Thus, on the eve of the strange ship's arrival, the Aztec Empire was a powder keg waiting for a spark. From the outside, it was the most powerful state Mesoamerica had ever known. But on the inside, it was an empire of enemies. The Totonacs on the coast were restless, the southern kingdoms were resentful, and the Tlaxcalans were nursing a generations-long hunger for revenge. It has become a great historical debate. Was the empire on the verge of collapse on its own? Perhaps. Its system of rule through brutal extraction was arguably unsustainable. All that was missing was a catalyst, an outside force that could provide the leadership, the technology, and the sheer audacity to unite these disparate streams of resentment into a single, overwhelming flood. Moctezuma sat on a throne of gold and jade, but it was a throne perched atop a volcano of hatred, and far away across the eastern sea, the catalyst was preparing to make landfall. In the year 1519 of the European calendar, or one read in the sacred count of the Mexica, a year of profound and terrifying significance, the first reports began to trickle into Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma's spies on the hot and humid Gulf Coast sent frantic messages, their descriptions bordering on the fantastical. They spoke not of boats, but of floating mountains or great towers with white wings, moving across the eastern sea. From these impossible vessels came a race of men unlike any they had ever seen. They had skin as pale as limestone, hair that grew thick upon their faces, and they were encased in a strange gleaming material that shone like the sun itself. They were accompanied by terrifying beasts, hornless deer of immense size that they rode upon as one being, and massive, ferocious dogs that strained at their leashes. The omens were no longer whispers. They had taken on flesh and bone and had landed on the shores of the empire. The leader of this strange band of about 500 men was a minor Spanish nobleman named Hernan Cortes. He was a man of immense ambition, profound charisma, and a capacity for utter ruthlessness that would have impressed even the most hardened Mexican general. Acting in open defiance of his superior, the governor of Cuba, Cortes had scraped together this private expedition, a desperate, all-or-nothing gamble to find the legendary sources of gold in this new world and seize a fortune for himself and his men. He was not a god, nor a diplomat. He was a conqueror, a product of a Spanish culture forged in 7 centuries of warfare, and he had come to claim this new land for his king, his god, and most of all, for himself. As soon as they established a camp on the coast, the Spanish were met by emissaries from Moctezuma, and here, in these first crucial encounters, Cortes was blessed with a linguistic miracle that would prove to be his single greatest weapon. Among his men was a priest, Geronimo de Aguilar, who had been shipwrecked in the Yucatan years before and had learned the local Mayan language. Soon after, the local Totonac people, weary of their Aztec overlords, gifted Cortes a group of enslaved women. One of these women was named Malintzin, a sharp and intelligent Nahua noblewoman who had been sold into slavery and had learned to speak Mayan. This created a perfect chain of translation. Cortes could speak Spanish to Aguilar, who would translate it into Mayan for Malintzin, who would then speak in Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, to Moctezuma's emissaries. The flow of information was almost entirely one way. The Aztecs had no such window into the minds of the Spanish. Malintzin, later christened Doña Marina, would become Cortes's indispensable advisor, strategist, and consort, her voice the bridge across which an empire would fall. For Moctezuma, sitting in his palace hundreds of miles away, this news was a theological crisis. The reports of the pale-skinned, bearded men arriving from the east in the year Worst Reed aligned with terrifying precision to one of the most sacred legends of his people. The story told of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, the fair-skinned, bearded god of knowledge and creation. Long ago, he had been driven from his capital by the dark magic of his rival, Tezcatlipoca. As he departed across the eastern sea, he promised he would one day return, in the year of his birth, Worst Reed, to reclaim his rightful throne. Now, the prophecy seemed to be coming true. Moctezuma was paralyzed by a terrible uncertainty. Were these men the returning god himself? Were they divine messengers, or were they merely foreign invaders? The fatalistic, priestly side of his nature could not dismiss the divine possibility. In his confusion, he made a catastrophic error in judgment. Instead of dispatching an elite army to wipe the small band of foreigners from the face of the earth, he sent gifts. His emissaries arrived at the Spanish camp, bearing treasures meant to honor, appease, and perhaps intimidate a potential god. They brought magnificent ceremonial robes, intricate featherwork shields, and 2 immense discs as large as cartwheels, one of solid silver representing the moon, and another of pure, shining gold, representing the sun. To the Mexica, this was the ultimate display of wealth and reverence. To Cortes and his men, who had endured immense hardship and risked everything for a rumor of treasure, these gifts were like gasoline poured onto a fire. The offerings were not a deterrent. They were an invitation, an undeniable confirmation that the legends were true. This empire was fabulously, unimaginably wealthy, and Cortes now knew he would stop at nothing to possess it. Whether Moctezuma truly believed Cortes was a god, or if this was a story later exaggerated by the Spanish to make their conquest seem preordained, is a deep historical mystery. What is certain is that he hesitated. He chose diplomacy and appeasement when only overwhelming force could have saved him. Having seen the treasures, and having already begun to hear of the deep resentments the local Totonac people held for their Aztec masters, Cortes made his final, audacious move. He marched his men down to the shore and deliberately destroyed his own ships, scuttling them in the shallow water. There would be no retreat. There would be no return to Cuba. Before them lay a vast and powerful empire, and behind them was the sea. It was now victory or death. The small, determined army turned its back on the coast and began its seemingly impossible march inland toward the shimmering, mythical heart of the Aztec world. The march of Hernan Cortes and his small army from the coast was an act of almost unimaginable audacity. A tiny band of adventurers setting out to conquer an empire of millions. Their steel swords, crossbows, and handful of cannons gave them a technological edge. But their true weapons were the deep political fractures of the empire itself, and they were about to strike at its most significant fault line. Their path inland took them directly to the lands of the Tlaxcalans, the one people who had never bowed to the Aztec sun. The Tlaxcalans, seeing these strange invaders in their territory, met them not with diplomacy, but with ferocious, all-out war. For weeks, the Spanish were subjected to relentless assaults by tens of thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors. They were surrounded, exhausted, and on the brink of annihilation. But their discipline, their steel armor, and the terrifying shock of their cavalry charges allowed them to narrowly survive each onslaught. Having failed to destroy the newcomers, the Tlaxcalan leadership made a fateful, pragmatic calculation. They had seen the Spaniards' effectiveness in battle and recognized in their defiance a shared and consuming hatred for the Mexica. They decided that these strangers, whoever they were the weapon they had been waiting for. They offered Cortes an alliance. This was the turning point of the entire conquest. Suddenly, Cortes was no longer the commander of a few hundred weary conquistadors. He was the leader of a massive combined army with thousands of the finest and most motivated warriors in Mesoamerica at his back, all of them burning with a generational desire to see Tenochtitlan fall. The new alliance's first target was the great city of Cholula, a sacred pilgrimage site loyal to the Aztecs. As they entered the city, Cortes was warned by his translator, Malintzin, of a plot to ambush and slaughter his men. Deciding on a preemptive and brutal show of force, Cortes lured the Cholula nobles and priests, unarmed, into a temple courtyard. At his signal, the Spanish opened fire with their muskets and crossbows, and the Tlaxcalan warriors, waiting outside, poured in, slaughtering thousands in a merciless massacre. News of the event spread like wildfire, sending a wave of terror across the land. Moctezuma, hearing of the effortless destruction of one of his most powerful allies, became more convinced than ever that resistance against these men was futile. His resolve crumbled. Finally, the combined army marched over the high pass between the snow-capped volcanoes, and from that vantage point, they laid eyes on their destination for the first time. The sight that greeted them was something out of a dream. Spread across the valley below was a vast, shimmering lake, and in its center, as if floating on the water, was the city of Tenochtitlan, a gleaming metropolis of whitewashed pyramids, temples, and towers, all connected to the mainland by three great causeways. It was larger, cleaner, and more magnificent than any city these Spanish soldiers had ever seen, and the sight filled them with a mixture of awe, greed, and profound dread. On November the 8th, 1519, Moctezuma made his final, fateful decision. He would welcome the strangers into his city as guests. On the great southern causeway, the two worlds met. Moctezuma, the Huey Tlatoani, was carried on a magnificent feather-decked litter, adorned in gold and precious jewels, the semi-divine ruler of the known world. Cortez, the bearded adventurer, approached on his horse. It was a moment of supreme, world-altering drama. The Spanish were housed in a vast palace complex in the heart of the city and were treated as the honored guests. For days, they wandered the city in a daze, astounded by the scale of the Tlatelolco market, the beauty of the Chinampa gardens, and the terrifying blood-soaked grandeur of the Templo Mayor. But they knew they were in a gilded cage, a handful of men on an island surrounded by a sea of warriors. Cortez understood his position was untenable. He needed leverage, and he devised a plan of almost insane boldness. Using a minor skirmish on the coast as a pretext, he went with a small group of his most trusted captains to Moctezuma's palace. There, through a combination of veiled threats and persuasive diplomacy, he forced the emperor of the Aztec Empire to leave his own palace and come with them, to live under their guard in their quarters. Moctezuma, the great speaker, became a hostage in his own capital. Why he agreed to this humiliating act is a mystery that has haunted historians for centuries. Perhaps he truly believed resistance was sacrilege against the gods, or perhaps he was a pragmatist trying to avert a bloody battle in his city streets. Whatever his reasons, his capture was a masterstroke for Cortez. From that moment on, Cortez ruled the empire through its captive king. A surreal and deeply uneasy peace settled over Tenochtitlan. The emperor was a prisoner. The Aztec nobles were growing restless and enraged, and a few hundred Spanish adventurers from a single fortified palace now held the reins of a Mesoamerican superpower. The uneasy peace in Tenochtitlan was a fiction, a delicate skin of tranquility stretched taut over a boiling cauldron of resentment. For months, the Aztec nobility watched as their divine ruler, Moctezuma, became a puppet for a handful of bearded foreigners. They saw their empire's wealth being cataloged and appraised with greedy eyes, and their sacred rituals being openly mocked. A new, more aggressive leader emerged from the warrior class, Moctezuma's own brother, Cuitlahuac. The city was a coiled spring, and just as the tension reached its breaking point, Cortez was forced to leave. Word arrived that a rival Spanish army had landed on the coast, sent by the governor of Cuba with orders to arrest him. Leaving his most trusted, but notoriously hot-headed Captain Pedro de Alvarado in charge, Cortes took the bulk of his forces and raced to the coast to save his command. It was a fatal decision. Left in charge of the city, Alvarado's paranoia festered. When the time came for the great festival of Toxcatl, a major celebration to honor the god Tezcatlipoca, he saw the gathering of thousands of the city's best warriors and nobles dancing and chanting in the great temple's sacred courtyard, not as a religious ceremony, but as the prelude to an attack. He made a horrific miscalculation. Believing he was launching a preemptive strike, he ordered his men to seal the courtyard's exits. Then they fell upon the unarmed and unsuspecting Aztec elite, slaughtering the flower of the city's nobility in a brutal, unprovoked massacre. The city erupted. The sacrilege and the slaughter were the final insults. Spontaneously, the entire populace rose up in a furious rebellion. The sound of the great serpent skin war drum boomed from the top of the Templo Mayor, and the streets filled with warriors. Alvarado and his men were driven back into their palace fortress and placed under a relentless siege. Cortes, having brilliantly defeated his Spanish rivals and persuaded the survivors to join his cause, marched back to Tenochtitlan at the head of a much larger army. He fought his way through the enraged city to relieve the siege, but in doing so, he walked directly into the trap. He and his entire force were now besieged within the palace, surrounded by a city that wanted them dead. In a desperate bid to quell the uprising, Cortes forced Moctezuma to appear on the palace roof to speak to his people, but the emperor's authority was gone. The crowd below met him not with reverence, but with a shower of stones and a volley of arrows, screaming that he was a coward and a traitor. He was struck and gravely wounded. How he finally died is a mystery. The Spanish claim he succumbed to his injuries, his will to live broken. The Aztec accounts maintain that the Spanish, realizing their puppet king was no longer of any use, murdered him in the palace. With Moctezuma's death, the last flimsy pretext of Spanish authority vanished, and Cortes knew their only option was to escape or be annihilated. On the rainy night of June 30th, 1520, they made their run. This was La Noche Triste, the sad night. Their plan was to sneak out along the western causeway to Tlacopan, using a portable wooden bridge to cross the gaps the Aztecs had torn in the road. But their escape was almost immediately discovered. Lookouts gave the alarm, and soon the great war drum was booming again, and conch shell trumpets echoed across the lake. The causeway became a corridor of death. Aztec warriors in thousands of canoes swarmed them from the dark water, raining arrows and slinging stones, while more warriors attacked from their rear. The portable bridge became stuck in the mud. The orderly retreat dissolved into a panicked, desperate rout. Spanish soldiers, weighed down by the bars of gold they had greedily stuffed into their armor, were pushed into the lake and sank without a trace. Others were cut down by the slashing obsidian edges of the macuahuitl, or grappled by warriors and dragged into the canoes, destined for the sacrificial stone. The narrow causeway was a scene of utter chaos and slaughter, a bottleneck of struggling men, frightened horses, and the screams of the dying. By the time the sun rose, the few who had survived, including Cortes himself, had made it to the mainland. They were a shattered and broken remnant of the proud army that had entered the city months before. They collapsed in exhaustion under a great ahuehuete tree, and it is said that Cortes, the iron-willed commander, wept at the scale of his defeat. He had lost nearly half of his Spanish soldiers, thousands of his Tlaxcalan allies, all of his cannons, and every last ounce of the treasure he had amassed. They had been utterly and humiliatingly expelled from Tenochtitlan. For the Aztecs, it was a glorious and bloody victory. They had driven the invaders from their sacred city. But the man weeping under the tree was not a man who accepted defeat. He was already planning his revenge. In the immediate aftermath of La Noche Triste, Tenochtitlan was a city exultant. The Mexica celebrated their stunning victory, clearing the causeways of the dead and dragging the few Spanish and Tlaxcalan prisoners they had captured up the steps of the Templo Mayor for a triumphant, vengeful sacrifice. They had faced the strange invaders and their terrifying beasts, and they had won. A new, respected war leader, Moctezuma's brother Cuitlahuac, was swiftly elected as the new Huey Tlatoani. To most, it seemed the nightmare was over, but as they celebrated, two new enemies were already moving against them: the unbreakable will of the Spanish commander and a silent, invisible killer that had arrived on the Spanish ships. Cortes and his broken army, having survived their desperate flight, were not yet safe. A massive Aztec army intercepted them at the plains of Otumba. It was a final do-or-die moment. In a stunning display of tactical brilliance and sheer desperation, Cortes and his handful of surviving cavalrymen charged directly into the heart of the vast Aztec host, breaking through to kill the army's richly adorned commander. Leaderless and thrown into confusion, the Aztec army disintegrated, allowing the Spanish to escape. They limped back to the safety of their allies in Tlaxcala, a battered but not beaten force. There, Cortes began to meticulously plan his revenge. While the Spanish were healing and reforging their alliances, the second, more terrible enemy was beginning its work. Smallpox, a disease unknown in the Americas, had been introduced to the mainland by one of the soldiers from the coast. It spread with terrifying speed through a population with absolutely no natural immunity. The great city of Tenochtitlan, with its dense population, became a charnel house. People broke out in agonizing sores, dying in such numbers that there was no one left to bury the dead. The plague, which the Aztecs called the Huicocalistli, or the Great Pestilence, crippled the city's leadership and its military, killing the new emperor Cuitlahuac after a reign of only 80 days. It was a biological catastrophe that shattered morale and created a profound crisis of faith. Why were their gods silent while they died and the invaders remained untouched? Cortes, meanwhile, was preparing his masterstroke. He knew he could not take the island city by direct assault. He had to control the lake. In an incredible feat of logistics and engineering, he ordered the construction of 13 small, fast warships called brigantines, which could be fitted with cannons. They were built in the forests of Tlaxcala, then disassembled and carried piece by piece over the mountains by thousands of indigenous porters to be reassembled on the shores of Lake Texcoco. By the spring of 1521, Cortes was ready. A brave young warrior named Cuauhtemoc, the Descending Eagle, had been chosen as the last Aztec emperor, and he was determined to fight to the end. The siege of Tenochtitlan began in May. It was a slow, methodical, and brutally efficient strangulation. Cortes launched a three-pronged assault with his armies, now swollen with tens of thousands of Tlaxcalan and other allied warriors, seizing control of the three great causeways. His new fleet of brigantines, unstoppable by the Aztec war canoes, swept the lake, giving him total naval supremacy. He destroyed the great aqueduct from Chapultepec, cutting off the city's supply of fresh water. Tenochtitlan was now an island prison. Nothing and no one could get in or out. What followed was not a single battle, but a grinding 93-day ordeal of unimaginable horror. The fighting was street to street, house to house. The Spanish would advance during the day, tearing down buildings as they went, and the Aztecs, fighting with desperate courage under the command of Cuauhtémoc, would often push them back at night. But inside the city, starvation and disease were doing what blades alone could not. The inhabitants were reduced to eating lizards, leather, and the bark from trees. The fresh water was gone, and the canals were choked with the bodies of the dead. Still, they refused to surrender. Slowly, inexorably, the Allied forces pushed deeper into the dying city, leveling it as they advanced. The final, desperate stand took place in the northern district of Tlatelolco. Finally, on August 13th of 1521, a Spanish brigantine spotted a large decorated canoe attempting to flee the battle zone. On board was the Emperor Cuauhtémoc, trying to escape to continue the fight from another location. His capture signaled the end. The last pockets of resistance fell silent. The siege was over. The city that had once seemed like a dream was now a smoking corpse-strewn ruin. The combination of Spanish steel, European disease, and the vengeful fury of the Aztecs' own former subjects had achieved the unthinkable. The fifth sun, the great cosmic age of the Mexica, had finally, violently, and tragically been extinguished. When the last desperate battle cry faded and the capture of Cuauhtémoc brought the fighting to an end, a terrible silence fell over the ruins of Tenochtitlan. For the victorious Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies, it was a moment of grim triumph. For the Mexica survivors, it was the end of the world. The magnificent city, the center of their cosmos, was a waterlogged and smoldering necropolis, its canals choked with the bodies of the dead, the air thick with the stench of disease and decay. The first act of the conquerors was not to offer succor, but to begin a frantic and ultimately disappointing search for treasure. The vast hoards of gold that had been lost during La Noche Triste were never fully recovered. In their greed and frustration, the Spanish subjected the captured emperor, Cuauhtémoc, to horrific torture, putting his feet to the fire to force him to reveal where the city's wealth was hidden. His stoic and defiant silence in the face of this agony would become the stuff of legend, a symbol of his people's unbroken spirit. Having won the war, Hernán Cortés now faced the challenge of building a new peace, a new colonial order. He made a decision of immense symbolic and strategic importance. He would not abandon the ruined island city to build his new capital elsewhere. He would build it directly on top of the ashes of Tenochtitlan. This was the ultimate statement of conquest. It was not a merger or an accommodation. It was a replacement. The physical embodiment of the old world would be systematically erased and a new one built from its very stones. The great pyramids and temples that had once been the heart of the Aztec religion were the first to go. Thousands of Mexica laborers, The former masters of a continent were put to work dismantling their own sacred monuments. The process was one of deliberate architectural substitution. The rubble from the demolished temples was used to fill in the canals and level the ground, making the city less aquatic and more European. The massive carved stones of the Templo Mayor, the sacred center of their universe, were pried apart and used to lay the foundations for the first Christian cathedral of what would be called Mexico City. The sprawling palace of Moctezuma was torn down to make way for a grand palace for Cortes himself, which would later become the palace of the Spanish viceroys. The great central plaza, the Zocalo, remained the heart of the city, but it was now a Spanish square, dominated by a church and a governor's palace instead of a pyramid. The layout of the new city reflected a new social order. At its center was the Traza, a neat grid of streets reserved exclusively for the Spanish conquerors and colonists. The indigenous population was segregated into districts on the periphery, often in the same locations as their old Calpulli, where they would live as a permanent underclass, providing the labor that built and sustained the colonial capital. Parallel to this physical conquest was a spiritual one, which was in many ways even more profound. Hot on the heels of the soldiers came the first Franciscan friars, men of a different kind of conviction, who saw their mission as the liberation of the native people from the clutches of the devil. The spiritual conquest began with the destruction of the old religion. Idols were smashed, sacred texts were burned, and priests were hunted down. Churches and monasteries were deliberately constructed on the exact sites of former Aztec temples, a constant visible reminder that a new god now reigned. But the most effective missionaries were not just destroyers, they were also scholars. Men like the Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún undertook a massive effort to learn the Nahuatl language and to document in exhaustive detail every facet of Aztec life, religion, and history. Their goal was to understand the old ways in order to more effectively stamp them out, but in doing so, they ironically became the primary custodians of the very culture they were trying to erase, preserving for posterity the knowledge that would otherwise have been lost. Cortés's decision to build upon the ruins was not just symbolic, it was deeply pragmatic. Tenochtitlan was the established hub of Mesoamerica. Its tribute routes, its marketplaces, and its political significance were ingrained in the minds of millions. By building Mexico City on the same spot, Cortés was not just creating a new capital, he was performing a kind of institutional transplant, hijacking the ghost of the old imperial system. The tribute and labor that had once flowed to Moctezuma would now flow to him. As the new city began to rise, the sounds of its construction were the death knell of the old world. The rhythmic boom of the serpent-skin drum was replaced by the tolling of church bells, and the sharp chant of the warrior priests was replaced by the Latin Mass. The fifth sun had been eclipsed by the cross, and the physical world of the Aztecs was being buried layer by layer under a new Spanish reality. The fall of Tenochtitlan was the death of an empire, but it was not the death of a people. While the Spanish tore down the pyramids and imposed a new god and a new government, the culture of the Nahuatl-speaking peoples of central Mexico, the Nahua, proved to be far more resilient than stone. The decades that followed the conquest were a period of almost unimaginable trauma. War, famine, and the brutal exploitation of colonial labor were devastating, but they paled in comparison to the apocalyptic waves of European disease. Smallpox, measles, and influenza, against which the indigenous population had no defense, swept through the land, causing a demographic collapse so complete that it stands as one of the greatest tragedies in human history. Yet millions survived. They endured the end of their world and began the long, quiet, and arduous task of building a new one, weaving the threads of their ancient identity into the fabric of a new colonial reality. This survival was not accomplished through rebellion, but through a subtle and ingenious process of adaptation and fusion known as syncretism. The Nahua did not simply abandon their old ways. They blended them with the new, powerful culture of the Spanish, creating a unique hybrid civilization that was neither purely indigenous nor purely European. This process was most profound in the realm of religion. The Franciscan friars who arrived to carry out the spiritual conquest believed they were wiping out the old pagan beliefs, but often they were simply providing a new set of masks for the old gods. The most powerful example of this is the story of the Virgin of Guadalupe. The Aztec mother goddess, Tonantzin, had a major shrine on a hill called Tepeyac, a place of pilgrimage for centuries. Just a decade after the conquest, a converted Nahua man named Juan Diego reported seeing a vision of a dark-skinned Virgin Mary on that very same hill. This figure, who spoke to him in his native Nahuatl, became the Virgin of Guadalupe, and her shrine at Tepeyac is now the most important Catholic pilgrimage site in the Americas. Is she the Virgin Mary, or is she Tonantzin in a new, acceptable form? The answer is that she is both, a perfect symbol of the way indigenous faith survived by cloaking itself in the robes of Catholicism. This pattern was repeated across Mexico. Old gods were mapped onto Catholic saints, and pre-Hispanic agricultural festivals, with their deep connection to the land and the seasons, were absorbed into the Catholic liturgical calendar. The modern festival of Dia de Muertos, the Day of the Dead, with its vibrant mix of solemn Catholic ritual and joyful indigenous ancestor veneration, is another living testament to this resilient blending of two worlds. The most immediate and enduring legacy of the Nahua is the Nahuatl language itself. While Spanish became the language of power, Nahuatl continued to be spoken by millions, and it permanently enriched the Spanish spoken in Mexico. Through Spanish, hundreds of Nahuatl words have since entered the English language, becoming a quiet, daily reminder of the Aztec world. Every time you eat chocolate, from the Nahuatl socolotl, an avocado, ahuacatl, a tomato, tomatl, or a chili, you are speaking a fragment of the language of Moctezuma. The very foundations of Mexican culture today rest upon this indigenous bedrock. The culinary trinity of maize, beans, and squash remains the heart of Mexican cuisine. The traditional medical knowledge of herbs and plants was preserved and continued to be used. And even after the initial frenzy of destruction, a new generation of Nahua nobles, educated by Spanish priests, began a remarkable project of cultural preservation. Working with friars like Bernardino de Sahagún, these indigenous scholars and artists meticulously documented their own history, beliefs, and daily life, creating massive encyclopedic works like the Florentine Codex. These post-conquest codices written in both Nahuatl and Spanish, are our single most important window into the lost Aztec world, an act of cultural survival created in the very shadow of the conquest. The Spanish believed they had achieved a total spiritual victory, but the reality was far more complex. The Nahua people had learned the great lesson of all conquered peoples: how to bend without breaking, how to wear the mask of the conqueror while keeping the spirit of their ancestors alive in their hearts, their language, and their traditions, ensuring that their world did not truly end, but was instead transformed. For more than 4 centuries, the great city of Tenochtitlan was little more than a ghost, a half-remembered legend buried beneath the ever-growing metropolis of a new nation. Mexico City lived and breathed on top of its Aztec foundations, the stones of the Templo Mayor forming the base of its cathedral, the lines of the old causeways defining the paths of its modern avenues. Occasionally, a construction project would unearth a carved serpent head or a grimstone skull, a brief, startling reminder of the world that lay sleeping just a few feet below the pavement. But the true heart of the Aztec universe, the sacred precinct itself, remained lost to time, a place of myth rather than archaeology. Until one night in 1978, on the 21st of February, electrical workers digging a trench in the heart of the city, just off the main Zocalo Square, struck something hard. It was a massive, circular carved stone. As archaeologists were called in and carefully cleared the mud away, an image of breathtaking power emerged. It was a carving of a naked, dismembered female figure, her limbs severed from her torso. The archaeologists immediately knew who she was: Coyolxauhqui, the moon goddess, who, according to the sacred myth, was slain and dismembered by her newborn brother Huitzilopochtli at the base of Serpent Hill. And since Serpent Hill was the mythical name for the Templo Mayor, the scholars realized with a jolt of incredible excitement that if they had found Coyolxauhqui, then they had finally, after nearly 500 years, found the exact location of the great temple itself. This accidental discovery launched one of the most thrilling archaeological projects of the 20th century. The colonial buildings that had been built on top of the sacred site were carefully demolished, and for the first time since the conquest, the foundations of the Aztec Holy of Holies were revealed to the sky. The excavation uncovered not one temple, but a series of 7 distinct pyramids, each one built like a layer of an onion over the previous one by successive rulers. At its heart, they found the twin staircases leading up to the shrines of Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc. And buried within the layers of the temple, archaeologists discovered more than 100 sealed caches of ritual offerings, or ofrendas. These time capsules were a perfect map of the empire's reach and its worldview. There were precious turquoise masks from the Mixtec lands, jade figures from the Maya of Guatemala, seashells from both the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, and the skeletons of jaguars, crocodiles, and golden eagles, all animals of immense symbolic power. The Templo Mayor had been the center of their world, and they had filled its foundations with a living, breathing model of their entire cosmos. This unearthing of the Aztec past has had a profound impact on the modern identity of Mexico. The Aztecs are no longer just a mythologized beginning, but a tangible, excavated reality, with the ruins of their great temple now standing in a vast museum right beside the cathedral that replaced it. The most potent symbol of this enduring legacy is woven into the very fabric of the nation itself. The central image on the modern Mexican flag is the divine sign that signaled the end of the Mexica's long migration. A golden eagle perched on a prickly pear cactus, devouring a serpent. The origin story of Tenochtitlan is the origin story of Mexico itself, a powerful declaration that the nation's roots are planted deep in its indigenous past. The story of the Aztecs, which began with a small, unremarked tribe, leaving a mythical island, is therefore not just a story of a lost civilization. It is a story of spectacular ingenuity, of a people who built a Venice of the New World in the middle of a lake. It is a story of a complex and sometimes terrifying worldview, of a people who believed it was their sacred duty to keep the sun in the sky. And finally, it is a story of incredible resilience, of a culture that, despite the devastation of conquest, refused to vanish. The great empire of Moctezuma is gone. Its fifth sun has set. But its echoes are everywhere, in the Nahuatl words that pepper our languages, in the foundational foods of Mexican cuisine, and in the symbol of the eagle that flies proudly at the center of a modern nation's flag. The city of Tenochtitlan is quiet now, its pyramids sleeping beneath the streets. But for those who know how to listen, its story continues to whisper from the stones.